Article 8, the motion under Article 9 requires a two-thirds vote. Motion under Article 9 is on page 9-7, that the town acquire by gift, etc., certain permanent and temporary easements. Again, moved by Mr. Franco, seconded by Mr. Brown. The motion under Article 10 is on page 10-3, that the town release any and all interests in a certain easement. Article 11, the motion is on 11-2, that the town grant a permanent easement for parking spaces at the relocated intersection of Washington Street. And finally, Article 12 is at the bottom of page 12-2 over to page 12-3, that the town appropriate $250,000 for various purposes set forth in the motion as a portion of the town's $1 million construction match for the Gateway East project. This is a transfer, not an appropriation from, so that it was not included in the budget. There's one change in that motion at the bottom of page 12-2. Voted that the town, the printed version says will appropriate, strike the word will, so it reads voted that the town appropriate, etc. Mr. Franco? And by the way, there were some comments after last night's session about shorter members of our body not being able to be seen over the laptop, new laptop on the podium. There are two remedies. One is to fold down the top of the laptop. The other is that we have a courtesy of Ms. Orsini. We have a stool this evening, which I guess is behind Mr. Franco, and it's available for those of you who need to use it. Mr. Franco.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and through you to the body. Ben Franco for unanimous Select Board. In November 2016, I stood before town meeting urging approval of a special zoning district at the Industrial Island bordered by Brookline Avenue, Washington Street, and River Road as a means of facilitating implementation of Brookline's vision for a welcoming gateway, an improved public realm, and better pedestrian and bike access in the Route 9 corridor between the Boston border and Brookline Avenue. I stand before you tonight again urging town meeting to authorize steps necessary to improve the Route 9 corridor and to make it an active, vibrant, green streetscape that matches the community's vision for the area with transportation infrastructure that allows for safe and efficient travel by motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists. Articles 8 through 12 are technical articles that authorize the town to proceed with the long-discussed Gateway East project. Favorable action on these articles will authorize the town to obtain the temporary and permanent easements necessary for the construction of the Gateway East project, which includes the alteration of Walnut Street and Washington Streets, and the addition of infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists. Extinguish an easement at Brookline Place that is no longer needed, and make available the funds necessary for the town to comply with its financial commitments associated with Gateway East. Before discussing the details of Articles 8 through 12, I would like to remind the body about what Gateway East is and what it seeks to achieve. Formal planning for Gateway East began nearly a decade ago following discussions of the concept in a 2006 town report creating Gateway East, a public realm plan. The Gateway East report followed years of community frustration about the lack of trees and greenery in the area, the auto-centric nature of the Route 9 corridor, and the focus on moving cars and pedestrians through, but not around, the area. As the 2016 Gateway East Public Realm Plan notes, the goal of Gateway East is to make Route 9 into more of a boulevard and less of a highway. Decades of planning studies, most recently in 2016, have uniformly recommended balancing the following as a means of facilitating the realization of our collective vision for this part of town: commercial and residential projects, enhancing pedestrian amenities, easing pedestrian navigation, and creating district plans. The Gateway East project would directly implement recommendations 2 and 3 and indirectly support recommendation number 4 by realigning Walnut Street to create a four-way intersection with Pearl Street and Washington Streets, improving the flow of traffic down and across Route 9, installing new pedestrian crossings of Route 9 at the new Walnut, Pearl, Washington Street intersection that will be coordinated with newly installed traffic signals, providing a safe pedestrian crossing in the heart of Brookline Village in place of the demolished pedestrian bridge, investing in additional traffic and pedestrian signals corridor-wide to better coordinate the movements of motorists, bicycles, and pedestrians, creating protected bicycle lanes, dedicating a portion of the roadway to existing users who today lack a safe location for travel, dedicating sidewalk and roadway space to the creation of planting strips for trees, flowers, and other vegetation that will make the corridor more pedestrian-friendly by creating physical boundaries between pedestrians, cars, and cyclists. What you see on the screen is a picture of the project area today. You see Route 9 running through the center of the image with Brookline Place and Brookline Village at the top of the screen, and Station 1 in the Brook House at the bottom. The Gateway East project area abuts 8 parcels of varying sizes, all of them bordered directly or indirectly by Route 9. The project area is a heavily trafficked and desirable location down the street from the LMA and just outside of Brookline Village at the confluence of major roadways and MBTA bus and Green Line branches. And, as you see, the stretch of Route 9 between High Street and the Boston border is a stretch of roadway that is primarily automotive-focused and that does not match our community's vision for what a welcoming gateway into Brookline should be and what is acceptable in terms of design and character. I want to spend just a few seconds illustrating for you what passage of Article 8 through 12 will enable to occur before drilling down into the mechanics of the individual articles. With passage of these articles, this part of town could one day look like this: a more active, friendly, greener streetscape, and a hardscape that has pedestrian scale lighting and better matches the community vision for the area, similar to the improvements that were realized through the Emerald Necklace Bike and Pedestrian Crossing project. Here's a view of the user's experience today when they try to navigate Route 9 outbound at Brookline Village, an auto-centric urban corridor where pedestrians and bicyclists face challenges as they look to access our commercial areas, public transit, and Emerald Necklace and the LMA. A portion of Articles 8 through 12 would transform this auto-centric corridor into an area where all modes of transportation can coexist. So, how was the Gateway East plan developed, and how has the town translated Brookline's vision for a welcoming gateway and improved public realm and better pedestrian and bike access into a construction project? Like all major projects in Brookline, it involved an appointed committee and numerous public meetings and hearings, including the Gateway East Citizens Advisory Committee, made up of residents of the town, Brookline Village, merchants, and town officials. They met from 2005 and in 2006 to create the Gateway East Public Realm Plan, and again in 2009 and 10 as 25% design plans began to take shape. The Select Board held public meetings to allow for public comment prior to the submission of 25% designs in 2012 and 75% designs in 2017. The Brookline Transportation Board also held public meetings to review the project design and allow for public comment prior to the submission of a 25% and 75% design. And Mass Department of Transportation co-hosted public information meetings with the town in 2014 and 15 and held its 25% design public hearing at Brookline Town Hall in April 2017. That brings us today, over 10 years removed from the town's initial visioning for this corridor, after a tremendous public process and after numerous project coordination meetings with MassDOT staff to refine the project based on public comment. Town meeting tonight is being asked to approve 5 articles that would do the following. Article 8 and 9 seek authorization for the town to acquire 7 permanent and 11 temporary easements to allow for the construction of improvements such as sidewalks, drainage structures, traffic and pedestrian signals, and other physical improvements within the project area, and to allow for realignment of Walnut Street to create a 4-way intersection at Washington and Pearl. Article 9 also authorizes the appropriation of $250,000 toward the cost of compensating the landowners the town is seeking to obtain easements to. The property owners are aware of the Gateway East project and have been approached by the town to discuss the particulars of easement acquisition. Those conversations are ongoing. Article 8 and 9 are necessary to allow the Select Board to take possession, of the permanent and temporary easements at the appropriate time prior to the project being bid for construction by the Mass Department of Transportation. Article 10 seeks the partial release of an easement at 10 Brookline Place. The easement was obtained in 1972 to allow for the terminus of a pedestrian bridge crossing Route 9 to be constructed, for public transportation access to a portion of the property, and for the siting of a public water drain on the property. The pedestrian bridge was demolished in 2015, and that part of the easement is no longer necessary. Article 10 seeks to terminate that portion of the easement while preserving public transportation access to the land and the right for the town to maintain public utilities. Article 11 would grant exclusive access to 7 parking spaces to the Brookline Housing Authority in compensation for the parking spaces they will lose because of the realignment of Walnut Street. The new layout of Walnut Street will bisect an existing parking lot at the Housing Authority's Walnut Street development, causing the BHA to lose 24 surface parking spaces. The Housing Authority has expressed that an acceptable remedy would be for the town to provide exclusive use to 7 of the newly created spaces. Article 11 proposes the town meeting provide the necessary authorization to make this happen. Article 12 is another funding article that would authorize the expenditure of $250,000 toward meeting the town's $1 million construction match. The balance of the town's construction match will be funded by Children's Hospital through an agreement made in 2014 connected to the hospital's proposed redevelopment of Brookline Place. As an aside, the motion offered by the Select Board under Article 12 incorporates suggested language offered by town meeting member Hugh Madison about the inclusion of continuous planting strips in the project area. So why vote for these articles? I know I've given you a lot of information over the last 7 minutes, so I'll conclude by summarizing what these articles will enable to happen. The town will take a significant step toward achieving the long-standing planning goals for this part of town. The positive improvements already underway in the area will continue, and significantly improved sidewalks and vehicle, pedestrian, and bike circulation will be achieved in a very busy part of town. A unanimous Board of Selectmen urges favorable action on Articles 8 through 12.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. And Mr. Madison, would you come forward, please?
Cliff Brown, Precinct 14, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee on Articles 8, 9, 10, and 12. Sorry? No. The Advisory Committee unanimously recommends favorable action on the motion put forth by the Select Board. And on Article 11, by a vote of 25-0 with 1 abstention, the Advisory Committee recommends favorable action on the motion put forth by the Select Board. Thank you.
Mr. Madison?
Hugh Madison, Precinct 5. I already tested this out. If I stand up here, I am now taller than Mr. Kleckner. I'm not used to being that high. I urge you to to support Article 12. The 2005-2015 Comprehensive Plan talks repeatedly about the overall character of the Route 9 corridor and the need for a visual gateway to the town.
This is Hugh Madison from Precinct 5. I don't think you identified yourself, sir.
Yeah, I already said that.
Okay. I take it back.
The plan for Gateway East includes linking different projects together. Last June, the Transportation Board sent this letter to Mass DOT asking that the sidewalk width and tree lawn be enlarged. The poster now used at 1 and 2 Brookline Place shows the row of trees connected with a tree lawn. These trees were removed in 2016. The pedestrian experience should be restored. This is what we have now. The design using continuous planting strips with natural soil will be sustainable and attractive. All bodies that have reviewed this article strongly support it. Your vote for this Article 12 will demonstrate this support to Mass DOT. Here are some nearby examples of continuous planting strips which add color, reduce the heat island effect, and aid in stormwater management. 10 Brookline Place, the new AC Hotel in Cleveland Circle, and Boylston Street in the Fenway. The Gateway East project, including the recent removal of the overpass, will transform this Brookline entrance. Let's enhance this improvement even more by voting for Article 12. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go through these motions one at a time. Article 8, motion on page 8-6, relating to altered layouts of Walnut Street and Washington Street. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Article 9, the motion on page 9-7 to acquire certain permanent and temporary easements. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Article 10. Motion on page 10-3 to release interests in an easement, etc. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Article 11. Motion on page 11-2 for an exclusive parking easement at the relocated intersection of Washington Street. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Article 12, motion at the bottom of page 12-2. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. I think that may be the end of unanimity, but let's see. Article 13. Motion under Article 13 is on page 13-4, that the selectmen grant an easement or lease of air rights over a portion of Pearl Street for the construction of a canopy over the main entrance to the building to be located at 2-4 Brookline Place. It's moved by Mr. Franco, seconded by Ms. Lodish. Mr. Franco and Ms. Lodish, you're already forward.
Ben Franco, again, for a unanimous select board. In 2014, Brookline Town Meeting gave final approval for the zoning changes and associated associated agreements necessary to allow for the redevelopment of Brookline Place to proceed. Part of the Brookline Place package Town Meeting authorized was the signing of a memorandum of agreement, which, following the vote, the select board entered into. The MOA provided clarity about how the redevelopment of Brookline Place would occur by spelling out when specific actions and events would take place, and by codifying the commitments made during conversations between Children's Hospital and the town prior to town meeting's action. For example, the The MOA set dates by which certain actions would be undertaken and formalized children's commitment to contribute to the cost of removing a pedestrian bridge that formerly spanned Route 9 and to improve the public realm and infrastructure that surrounds Brookline Place. Article 13 was filed by Children's Hospital this spring to allow for the construction of a 6.75-foot by 42.7-foot canopy at the proposed 24 Brookline Place building. The proposed canopy would shelter a portion of the building's pickup and drop-off area. The canopy, which was discussed in 2014, would overhang a portion of the public sidewalk, requiring the granting of the easement Article 13 seeks. The Select Board recommends a vote of favorable action on Article 13.
Thank you, Ms. Lotish. Whoops,
Excuse me,
sorry.
Mr. Utter, I'm
I
not
beg your
quite
pardon.
concluded yet. The granting of an easement is in keeping with the Brookline Place redevelopment plan and would allow the construction of a reasonable amenity for patients and tenants of the 2-4 Brookline Place building. Additionally, a vote of favorable action will provide the town with the opportunity to clarify generally how the redevelopment will take place and specifically several provisions of the 2014 MOA. The clarity, assuming a vote of favorable action, would come in the form of a letter of understanding between the town and Children's Hospital. The letter would detail the implementation of several items in the 2014 MOA, including the town's desire to receive a check for the hospital's required contribution toward the reconstruction of Pearl Street, as opposed to Children's Hospital doing the work themselves, clarification about the exact work Children's and the town will do to improve the pedestrian lighting at the intersection of Brookline Avenue and Pearl Street, establishment of an oversight process for how off-site mitigation dollars will be allocated and spent, and definition of what specific actions in the MOA refer to and the steps necessary to have them completed. A draft letter of agreement was reviewed at the 2015 Select Board meeting, and on Tuesday at its meeting immediately prior to town meeting, the Select Board signed a letter of agreement substantially similar to the draft letter the board had previously reviewed and that was sent to all town meeting members in the supplemental mailing. Two final notes. First, the Select Board has incorporated into the agreement with Children's Hospital the Economic Development Advisory Board's helpful suggestion that the easement expire with 24 Brookline Place building. This means that when the building is removed, the easement terminates, practically requiring Children's or any future owner or developer to come back to the town for approval should they wish to continue to overhang the public sidewalk. And second, before Children's can utilize the easement, it will be required to compensate the town for the full and fair value of the public space they are seeking to occupy, approximately $16,000. In conclusion, again, the Select Board unanimously urges a vote of favorable action on Article 13.
Thank you. You through, Mr. Franco? Thank you. Ms. Lotish and Mr. Friedman, would you please come forward?
This article is rather straightforward. The advisory committee, by a vote of 22 to 0 to 1, recommended favorable action on the article.
On the motion at the bottom of page 13, Mr. Richmond?
I had a question, if I may.
Certainly may.
Clint Richmond, Precinct 9. If I'm reading, I'm 6. What did I say, precinct? God. I love all precincts.
We
Wish I
rely on
could
you
represent
for accurate
everyone.
information.
I just had a question. If I'm reading this diagram right, it looks like the canopy is overhanging the property line is into the public, not just the public sidewalk, but into the public way. Is that correct?
Mr. Franco?
Or are those curb cuts? I'm having trouble reading the diagram.
Ben Franco, member of the Select Board. It overhangs only the sidewalk.
And how common is it for overhangs that go into the sidewalk? Or do we have many other examples in town that we might compare and contrast with?
The one that immediately comes to mind is an article that this body voted several years ago for the Coolidge Corner Theater, where we granted air rights to that local business.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. On the motion on page 13-4, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. Motion carries unanimously. Article 14. The motion under Article 14, which is moved by Mr. Friedman, seconded by Mr. Waschinsky, is at the bottom of page 14-5, that the town authorize and empower the Select Board to grant a preservation restriction to the Mass Historic Commission in perpetuity on the structure known as the Brookline Reservoir Gatehouse. Mr. Friedman?
That's not mine. Well, this is 14, yeah. It's okay. Harry Friedman, Precinct 12, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. Tonight I'm here to talk about the Brookline Reservoir. The reservoir is located on the south side of Boylston Street, Route 9, also bordering Lee, Dudley, and Warren Streets, as you can see in the map behind. The area was once low-lying pasture land with a marsh in the center and a stream running through it. The reservoir was originally built as a drinking water supply for the city of Boston. Built and filled to capacity in 1848, it was part of the system which delivered water from Lake Cochituate, out Wayland, Natick area, to Boston. It fed the Beacon Hill Reservoir that stood behind the State House. And so you can see on the map the State House at the lower end, a row of houses on Mount Vernon Street, and then the reservoir behind it. And then this is a back view of the reservoir. You can see the dome of the State House in the back of the picture. With the construction of the reservoirs at Chestnut Hill between 1866 and 1868, the Brookline Reservoir became a standby reservoir, used only in case of emergency. Brookline never used this reservoir since Brookline had its own reservoir on Fisher Hill. In 1902, the city of Boston decided to sell the reservoir and the surrounding land. The reservoir was purchased by the town of Brookline for $150,000. The gatehouse is at the northeast end of the park. Providing Boston with a public water system from towns to the west was a major engineering feat. This is what 19th century civic architecture looked like. The material, the attention to detail, and its solidity loudly proclaimed its importance. Built of granite, the main facade is in a Greek Revival style modeled on a temple front. The corners of the buildings have coins, the paler shade of stone running vertically at the corners. The facade is 3 bays wide with a centered entry on the lower level. The entry is recessed behind an arch that is flanked by round columns supporting an entablature. The entry is flanked by small, elongated, round arch windows. The upper level consists of 3 larger, equal-sized round arch windows. The upper level of the building also has a facade facing the water, which also has 3 round arch windows. The round arch windows indicate a transition from the Greek Revival to the Italianate style, which was popular in the 1840s. Because the gatehouse was intended as a public space, the interior was also finished. The walls were plastered, and there were stairs constructed of wrought iron, which were used to reach a platform giving a view of the water. These staircases are believed to be the oldest surviving example of wrought iron stairs intended for public use in the United States. In 1926, the gatehouse interior was altered to provide rooms and toilet facilities for swimming meets, skating, and other occasions, and a pier was built nearby. A 1945 plan to build a beach and a bathhouse near Lee and Dudley Streets was never realized. The Reservoir Park was considered briefly in 1956 as a possible location for a new town hall. The town has set aside $250,000 to convert a portion of the gatehouse to a single-occupant, gender-neutral, handicapped-accessible restroom, which would include a baby-changing station. Thus, the toilet facilities built in 1926 would be restored. In addition, the town is seeking a grant from the Massachusetts Historical Commission in order to do other repairs to the building. The maximum grant is $100,000, although if we get a grant, the amount is expected to be closer to half of that. We're here tonight because if the town receives the grant, Mass Historic requires the town to enter into a preservation restriction protecting the building and a 20-foot buffer around it in perpetuity. The restriction is meant to ensure that the historical integrity of the premises will be maintained, and that if major alterations are to be considered, they can be made only after Mass Historic has reviewed the proposed work and given its permission. The motion offered under warrant Article 14 would empower the Select Board to grant the preservation restriction. The preservation restriction would be identical to the one that currently exists for the Fisher Hill Gatehouse. The restriction only covers the gatehouse and a 20-foot buffer surrounding it. It requires Mass Historic permission before major alterations can be made to the gatehouse, and it does not affect the remainder of the park or Brookline's use of the remainder of the park. By a vote of 23 to 0 to 1, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on the motion offered under Article 14.
Mr. Wyszynski, is there anything you could possibly add to that, except the vote of the selectmen?
Neil Wyszynski for the Board of Selectmen. The Select Board voted 5-0. When this came before us, my only concern was making sure that we knew exactly what we were restricting, that we wouldn't run into a situation like we've run into at the Baldwin School where we accepted a small grant and we gave away rights that potentially could be costing us tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars for an $11,000 grant in the 1970s. So I'm confident that that's not going to happen here. So we recommend favorable action.
On the motion on page 14-5.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Robert Leal, Precinct 15. At one point, there was a proposal to expand the path on the side of the gatehouse that goes over the water to make it a little bit wider because it's very narrow right now. Would accepting this preservation prevent the ability to build that kind of path expansion?
Ms. Shute-Galantine?
Erin Galantine, Director of Parks and Open Space. Our renovation plan for the Brookline Reservoir Park does include expansion of the path in front of the gatehouse, which is currently only 36 inches wide. We're going to make that 10 feet. Mass Historic is well aware of that and supports that alteration.
Thank you. On the motion at the bottom of page 14-5, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously, and that will be the last of the unanimous votes. Oh, I beg your pardon. We might have one on 15. Article 15. The motion is on page 15-12 over to 15-19. It's an amendment of the erosion and sediment control bylaw, moved by Ms. Heller, seconded by Ms. Lodish. Ms. Heller.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Nancy Heller for unanimous Board of Selectmen. Select Board. This warrant article arises from a decision by town meeting in November of 2016 to refer a comprehensive tree protection bylaw proposal to a Select Board committee. That committee, of which I am chair, relied on the expertise of our arborist, Tom Brady, as well as citizens from various towns, boards, commissions, committees, and Green Space Alliance, and petitioner of the warrant article in 2016. We met many times. Our public meetings were usually attended by Hugh Madison, who, as you know, has a deep interest in the green canopy of Brookline. In our examination of the issue of how to protect private trees, and we have good protection of public trees, but none for private trees, from indiscriminate removal, we met with representatives of other communities that have standalone tree protection bylaws, and we heard of the difficulties, including the need for additional staff, of that approach. We also had several discussions with our town staff from building, planning, public works departments. We considered the role of trees in our environment. In addition to keeping Brookline beautiful, trees provide energy efficiency, absorb pollutants, reduce land surface temperatures, and avoid stormwater runoffs. We latched on to the latter effect, that is, the stormwater runoffs, in crafting the proposal before you tonight. The erosion and sediment control bylaw has been in place for several years, has worked well, and has permitting processes that are established in the town and well known by those who work in the landscaping and building fields. It makes sense to work with a well-established and well-known process to add that to, sorry, this is a little hard to manage here with all this stuff. It makes sense to work with a well-established and well-known process to add to that process provisions which will further enhance the goals of the same erosion and sediment control bylaw and will take a first step in the protection of private trees within the town. What do the proposed amendments do? Number 1, adds the definition of size of tree to be potentially protected as 8 inches or greater at diameter breast height, which means diameter at breast height, DBH. It adds a significant factor of trees, an aggregate of 32 inches DBH or greater to the triggers of this bylaw, so that if someone wants to remove one 32-inch or greater tree or 4 8-inch or greater trees, a plan under the erosion and sediment control bylaw is required to be filed before any tree removal action is taken. Number 3, adds a requirement that trees meeting the above definitions are to be identified on a plan, and a further requirement that such plan provide for measures for trees that remain, and that plan is submitted to the Department of Public Works. Adds to the current requirement of the DPW commissioner or designee who inspects and improves or disapproves the plan. That inspection and approval or disapproval shall include tree removal and protection measures of trees that remain. And the plans are already submitted, but now they're required to include the tree removal and plans for replacement. It would add to the, number 5, it would add to the provision regarding enforcement so that the DPW commissioner may take remedial action to enhance erosion control. Currently, the commissioner can suspend work that is, and that is more effective in action than fines, because developers especially find it more costly to have work stopped. But the provision needs to be expanded to include the remedial actions that are listed in the bylaw. In addition to improving and incorporating trees into the protective measure of the erosion and sediment control, this amended bylaw, if approved, will have an educational impact on those who are seeking to remove trees. The Tree Protection Study Committee is pleased to find a way to encourage the education, because we discussed at some length the issue of how to further educate the public about the value of our trees. The measure requires that people stop and think before planning to remove trees and to understand that without remedial measures, the removal action could have a detrimental effect on erosion. The bylaw does not prohibit people from removing trees, but they must do so in the context of whether the removal will affect erosion and what can be done to mitigate that erosion. 2 more quick points. The erosion and sediment control bylaw requires a permit, and there is a cost of $150 for that permit. If a plan is required in the context of tree removal only, we should remember that taking down a tree or trees equivalent to 32 inches diameter at breast height or greater is an action that should be done by a professional and not someone with a chainsaw and a desire to use it. Professional services for this type of work are significant, and the permit fee pales within that context. Also, even small-scale projects such as walkway installation usually trigger the permit requirement of the bylaw. Further, the submission of an erosion plan that includes trees helps the town track the removal and replacement of trees on private land, and that information can help us in our planning around climate change mitigation and adaptation. During the warrant article hearing process, Select Board's Climate Action Committee, the Planning Board, the Conservation Committee, the Advisory Committee, and the Select Board held public hearings and all voted favorable action by significant or unanimous margins. All of those bodies have recognized that this action represents a first step in the process. The Tree Protection Study Committee plans to continue to meet to work with town staff on the design of a more comprehensive site plan review process, which will streamline for the town and the public the permit process that occurs with many projects in the town. A unanimous Select Board urges favorable action on the motion on pages 5-12 to 519. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lodish.
Ms. Heller very carefully described the whole article, so all I have to do is report to you that the Advisory Committee, by a vote of 18 to 0 to 1, recommends favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Heiken.
Steve Heiken for the Planning Board. This is not strictly a zoning matter, and normally the Planning Board only addresses warrant articles that have to do with zoning. But this brings up some issues that are important enough to the Planning Board that we talked about this, held a hearing, and I wanted to offer some of the thoughts that the Planning Board has about this. This warrant article addresses a problem that the Planning Board is seeing more and more often, which is the frequent total or near total clear cutting of sites, either for new development or for the more and more frequent tear down and replacement of existing homes for new and significantly larger homes. And this is often done for the ease of construction, clear cut an entire site. Sometimes it's done to allow regrading of a site, often hilly sites, which are then partly leveled and retaining walls are created. And these measures certainly compromise stormwater management and the stability of the soil, but they also have a negative impact on the environment and the neighborhood context. Some of you have probably looked into your backyard areas and seen large numbers of trees disappear on a development around the corner. And the Planning Board only sees some of these projects. We only see these projects when a new construction requires a special permit. Otherwise, many of these things happen without any oversight at all up until now. And once that happens, even when it comes to the Planning Board, all we can do is maybe require some modification of the proposed grading or the replacement of landscape that's been lost, but we can't do anything to really replace the character of the site that existed before this clear cutting took place. So, in our opinion, this is a very well thought out strategic refinement of the stormwater management plan. We think that will help a lot in reducing the number of times that this thoughtless action takes place. One of the members of the Planning Board, Bob Cook, was on the committee that helped formulate this. He was the former director of the Arnold Arboretum, who added his expertise to this. So this will, in the end, help us implement one of the key requirements in our design review, which is preservation of trees and landscape. So the Planning Board urges approval of this warrant article.
And if you want to see an example of the problem that this warrant article is designed to address, take a look at what's happened at the corner of High and Allerton Street in Precinct 5. On the motion on pages 15-12 through 19, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries unanimously. There is no motion being offered under Article 16, and we now proceed to Articles 17 through 22. The main motion on Article 17 is on the rose-colored supplement, which was handed out last night. If any of you did not pick up a copy last night, it's this color, you can obtain one at the checkers tables in the lobby. These are the marijuana articles, and we will have a single debate on Articles 17 through 22, after which we will vote serially on each of the articles. So the motion under Article 17 is on pages 1 through 17 of the rose-colored supplement, moved by Mr. Lynn Jones and seconded by Ms. Hyatt. The Board of Selectmen offers an amendment found on page 6 of the Green supplement, moved by Mr. Green and seconded by Mr. Waschinsky. And if you look at page 6 of the rose-colored supplement, the selectmen would change in use number 29B, the fourth column from the left is an L district. The selectmen would change special permit to no, that is, that use would be forbidden in L districts. Mr. Waschinsky moves, it's on page 1 of the orange supplement, but if you turn to page 6 of the rose-colored supplement, you'll see what Mr. Waschinsky is about. Moves, and Mr. Gladstone seconds, that in use 29A in an L district, that use be changed from a special permit to a no, so that storefront marijuana retailers under Mr. Waschinsky's amendment would be forbidden in L districts. And as we go through the speakers, you will hear what an L district is and where they are, and lots of other things. Article 18, moved by Mr. Green, seconded by Ms. Hyatt. The motion is on page 18-14 through 23. Whereas Article 17 dealt with amendments to the zoning bylaw, this article deals with amendments to the general bylaws concerning marijuana establishments. Article 19. The main motion under Article 19 is offered by Ms. Frawley, found on page 1 of the blue supplement. It would limit the number of storefront marijuana retailers, delivery-only marijuana retailers, and social consumption marijuana retailers to 3 townwide. Is there a second to that motion? Second. Motion is seconded. Article 20, found on pages 20-4 to 7, moved by Mr. Green, seconded by Ms. Hyatt, to regulate, it's a general bylaw amendment to regulate personal consumption of marijuana. Article 21, on pages 21-2 to 3, moved again by Mr. Green, seconded by Ms. Hyatt, concerning enforcement measures, again, an amendment of the general bylaws. And finally, Article 22, the motion is on page 22-3 by Mr. Green and seconded by Ms. Hyatt, to permit the town to impose an excise tax of 3% on retail sales of marijuana within the town. We will hear from a number of speakers and then undoubtedly have a Q&A period. I call on Mr. Green. And if you don't need the laptop, you might as well just close the cover.
Mr. Moderator, Bernard Green speaking for the Select Board. There's a lot to cover. It's not so much complex as convoluted, and I only have 10 minutes to do it, so let's jump right into it. First, I want to draw people's attention to the frequently asked questions in the peach-colored pages in your materials. I think that's peach, that color. This is something that you can skim in between presentations to give you a good overview of the warrant articles. Secondly, the voting table distributed this evening outlines the impact of a yes or no vote on the warrant articles. Town staff will also be available to answer more detailed questions later on. Chapter 94G says a city or town may adopt ordinances and bylaws that impose reasonable safeguards on the operation of marijuana establishments, provided they are not unreasonably impractical. The warrant articles 17, 18, 20, and 21 embody the reasonable safeguards allowed in the law. Failure to enact these warrant articles, however, will put the town at the mercy of the much looser state regulatory scheme. And finally, in my introductory comments, I want to really focus on the fact that the push to legalize marijuana has been motivated in part by the shameful history associated with marijuana criminalization, including the intentional use of prohibition as a mass incarceration weapon against Black and Hispanic communities. That is why the statute requires the Cannabis Control Commission to ensure that communities that have been disproportionately harmed by marijuana law enforcement are able to participate fully in the new industry. Brookline, however, is not a community directly subject to those requirements. There are two classes of bylaws to be considered tonight. Warrant Article 17 is a zoning bylaw. It requires 2/3 vote of town meeting, but goes into effect immediately. Warrant Articles 18 to 22 are general bylaws that require majority vote and go into effect upon later approval by the Attorney General. Each warrant article accomplishes a specific goal. Warrant Article 17 amends the zoning bylaw to add marijuana regulations, including location and density regulations, and introduces a default cap on the number of special permits to be issued to marijuana establishments until Article 18 is approved by the Attorney General. The Select Board voted 3-2 for an amended version of this article. The changes to the original article related to excluding social consumption but not retail establishments from local business districts, and related to the major corridors. Warrant Article 18 accomplishes three things. One, creates a licensing scheme to allow the Select Board to issue annual licenses and review the operations of marijuana establishments, sets a cap for the total number of licenses for marijuana retailers by type, and regulates marijuana through the use of our general bylaws. The Select Board voted unanimously in favor of Article 18. Warrant Article 19 allows for a motion at town meeting to decrease the number of Select Board licenses below the cap set in Warrant Article 18. To implement Warrant Article 19 in Brookline, we would have to hold a townwide election following the town meeting vote. The Select Board voted no action on Warrant Article 19 this evening at this meeting, but urges those who vote yes on Warrant Article 19 to also vote yes on Articles 17 and 18 so that whatever number of establishments are in place, they will be subject to local regulation, not the looser state regulatory scheme. Warrant Article 20 regulates personal marijuana use, prohibits public consumption, open container type laws, or cultivation within the public view, and also prohibits at-home extraction using dangerous combustible materials. The Select Board voted unanimously in favor of Warrant Article 20. Warrant Article 21 assigns enforcement authority of marijuana regulations to specific departments in addition to the police department, which can enforce any general bylaws. The Select Board voted unanimously in favor of Warrant Article 21. Warrant Article 22 adopts a sales use tax of 3% on marijuana and marijuana products similar to the local meals tax, and the Select Board voted unanimously in favor of Warrant Article 22. The warrant articles work together. The zoning bylaw is designed to work with the general bylaws and to provide the town with protective regulation between June 1st, when the first establishment will open, and the date that the Attorney General finally approves the general bylaws. Okay, let me now discuss 4 hot topics, and hopefully I can get through them in the time left, that have been going around town and in the discussions of the Select Board. First, the number of marijuana establishments allowed in Brookline, which will be set in the zoning bylaw pending approval by the Attorney General of the general bylaws. Both warrant Articles 17 and 18 place a cap on the number of marijuana establishments at 20% of the number of packaged liquor stores in town, which is a minimum allowed by Chapter 94G without a vote of the electorate. That results in a maximum of 4 or 5 establishments in Brookline, depending on whether we use the additional licenses that are available under our current quota, issue the additional licenses. The Select Board believes that Brookline residents knowingly expressed their desire by a 60% favorable vote to have recreational marijuana in the Commonwealth, But we also believe that the town should move slowly and that the 4 to 5 cap is a prudent course. The cap would apply to retail, delivery, and, if pursuant to a petition of the voters and approval at an election, social consumption establishments such as marijuana cafes and also movie theaters. If town meeting votes to approve warrant Article 19 and the Attorney General approves the article, and a majority of the voters in a special election or general election vote favorably to reduce the number of allowed establishments, warrant Articles 17 and 18 will be amended to conform to that lower number. Warrant Article 19, however, cannot take away the license of New England Treatment Access, which is grandfathered under the new law, at least with respect to their medical activity. There is a proposal to reduce the number from 20% of the packaged liquor stores to 3 licenses in each category, a reduction of just 1 or 2 licenses, which the Board of Selectmen at its meeting tonight voted no action on. Let's see. The Select Board voted to recommend no action on Article 19, but again, if you vote yes on Article 19, please vote yes also on warrant Articles 17 and 18. The question of retail marijuana establishments and social consumption establishments, such as marijuana cafes, restaurants, and movie theaters, was discussed by the Select Board also. This will not be an issue until February 2019, when the Commission can start to issue social consumption licenses, and only if 10% of Brookline voters petitioned the Board, and a majority of the voters at a town-wide special or general election vote to approve such establishments. The Zoning Board bylaws table of uses will be amended if warrant Article 17 passes to replace the current moratorium with, among other uses, retail establishments, social consumption establishments, if allowed, and delivery services in particular zoning districts. The Advisory Board voted to permit retail and social consumption establishments in both general business and local business districts. The Select Board voted to permit only retail establishments in the local business districts, but did allow, if permitted by vote of the electorate, social consumption establishments in those, but not social consumption establishments, even if approved by the electorate in those districts. The reason for treating social consumption establishments differently in local business districts relates to the qualitative difference between retail and social consumption establishments. By definition, people leaving a social consumption establishment are going to be high. And most business districts, local business districts, lack nearby public transportation, resulting in people driving impaired. There will be an amendment by Neil Wyshynski to Select Board member Neil Wyshynski to restrict both retail and social consumption establishments in local business districts. He can speak to that at the proper time. Third, the issue of buffer zones separating marijuana establishments from K to 12 schools. The default distance in Chapter 94G is 500 feet. The Advisory Committee voted an exception for an area otherwise within the buffer zone, but across a major corridor that the Select Board adopted. I understand that Angela Hyatt for the Advisory Committee will go into this in more detail, so I'll not say anything more about that. Fourth is a question of density. The warrant articles have a 200 feet required separation between marijuana establishments, and a question has come up as to whether that separation applies between social consumption and retail, as well as social consumption and retail and retail. The warrant article language may be a little inartful, and some people view it as ambiguous. But the building commissioner who looked at this and would be the person who actually implements this bylaw does not see it as a problem. And he would make the decision as to whether a particular establishment can operate nearby or within 200 feet of another establishment. But we may want to address this issue in the future so that there is no ambiguity when a future building commissioner is asked to implement the bylaw. Another issue with respect to density has arisen, whether the 200 feet would apply if the store is across the municipal line in Boston or Newton? And the answer to this question is yes. I just say that because it was something that people asked. Finally, there are many other restrictions, protections, and requirements in the warrant articles that I haven't been given enough time to go through. You can ask questions of town staff if there are particular issues that you want to understand more. I think I haven't used up all my time, but I have nothing else to say. Thank you.
It was a tough negotiation on the Mr. Green's time limit, but he succeeded in staying within it. Ms. Hyatt and Ms. Margolis, would you please come forward and sit in the front row?
I like this. I could get used to this. Angela Hyatt speaking for a near unanimous advisory committee. Bernard has given an excellent summary, so what I'm going to do is expand on some items that I think deserve a little clarification, and I'm going to focus on the proposed zoning changes that are designed to provide a multi-tiered local control of recreational marijuana. As Bernard mentioned, the first type of control is on the number of licenses, and this is something that the state leaves up to cities and towns, and we have Articles 17 and 18 working together from a special permit point of view and licensing perspective to give a belt and suspenders approach that relates to the number of package store licenses. As Bernard mentioned, and I just want to emphasize that in the combined reports, there was some information that was a little misleading, and we've gotten clarification since those were published that the caps will apply to each type of recreational marijuana. So that's each type of retail, marijuana retailer. So that's storefront, delivery only, and social consumption. So if there's 4 right now, that will eventually be 12 by the beginning of next year when social consumption, if and when it is passed at a townwide referendum. The overwhelming majority of advisory committee favored the 20% cap proposed in Articles 17 and 18, rather than leaving no cap, which would happen if these articles fail. The second type of limitation is on density or the spacing between retailers, and this is something that is kind of hard to visualize, but the 200-foot spacing from retailer to retailer, as Bernard mentioned, means that, you know, in Brookline Village, if all storefronts were vacant and they had, you know, the choice of any place to go in, that might mean that there are 4 or 5 licenses that could be given within that part of the town. While there were widespread differences on the opinion about density within the advisory committee, a majority of us believes that the 200-foot minimum spacing between retailers will prevent clustering and encourage the uses to be more widely dispersed through the town, ultimately providing more options to businesses. We were not allowed to increase the spacing for retailers under the scope of the article. We could only decrease. The third limitation is on proximity to K through 12 schools, and the state default language talks about a 500-foot buffer, and we as on the advisory came up with this idea to think closely about buffers and what makes a buffer. The buffer zone as defined in the state default language is just a distance. It doesn't recognize other things, other physical aspects that might serve to act as a natural buffer. And so we came up with this idea to look carefully at the town and identify the 3 major east-west arteries, Comm Ave, Beacon Street, and Route 9, because of generally the speed and the amount of traffic, the street width, and in the case of Comm Ave and Beacon Street, the physical impediments, such as the Green Line tracks. So these are not barriers, but they tend to separate opposite sides of the street more from each other than in a typical streetscape. And we thought that by extending the buffer across those arteries, that we would unnecessarily limit the number of locations for marijuana. So we adopted that language, and that's what eventually the Select Board also adopted. By doing this, we opened up an additional 63 parcels and over 600 square feet of land available for marijuana retailers. The last limitation is on where these uses can be located, and this is a hot topic, as Bernard mentioned, especially with respect to L districts, the local business districts. Some members of the advisory committee felt very strongly that the L district should be removed completely. There is noted that there's relatively big money in marijuana, bigger than maybe dry cleaning or cake decorating, and that could drive up the rent of other businesses in the L districts. And there's also a belief that we should proceed cautiously. But the majority of the advisory committee felt like this, it was not worth limiting, taking the L districts out of the equation at this point. So the advisory committee has preserved the original warrant language where by special permit, storefront retailers and social consumption would be allowed in L districts. We did consider the Wyszynski amendment, of which I am also on that, and the motion failed. So to quote Marty Rosenthal, for those of you who basically want grass, you should vote favorable action on the advisory committee motion, which is the fuchsia supplement, for Article 17, as well as the Select Board's motion under Articles 18, 20, 21, and 22, and you should vote no action on Article 19. And for those of you who don't want grass, you should vote favorable action on all the articles, including 19, which supersedes 18 by reducing the number of licenses. Because even by voting favorably on all the articles, that the town has given, we give ourselves much more local control than the state buffer language would otherwise.
Thank you, Ms. Margolis.
Thank you. My name is Hadassah Margolis, town meeting member from Precinct 8. I am also a clinical social worker. I work with adult clients who are in treatment for mental health and addiction. This is the lens through which I view Articles 17 through 22. I am in favor of a slower rollout, meaning reducing the maximum number of marijuana establishments for now from 4 to a lower number, as stated in Article 19, as well as in the amendment. Our substance use epidemic is not just about opioids. I've seen firsthand the pain, shame, and guilt that comes with fighting addiction to marijuana. My clients talk about battling deep urges to use marijuana and how their marijuana use negatively impacts their daily functioning. There's so much that people in recovery struggle with. Clients working on sobriety talk about deliberately walking a certain way to work to avoid bars on a street. They don't trust that they will be able to pass the door without going in, even 15 years after their last drink. Let's not make recovery from substance use any harder than it already is. It isn't fair to people in our community working so hard to stay sober, to have to see so many marijuana establishments pop up all at once. There is a very common saying in recovery treatment: one step at a time. That's how recovery works. It is long and requires time to assess where you are and how you can be your most effective self. We owe it to our clients, friends, families, and neighbors to do this process one step at a time. Let's gather data, learn and see where we need to improve and ways to make it better, and then move on to the next step. Thank you.
We should bear in mind that the subject of whether or not to introduce marijuana retailing in Brookline is not before us. That horse is out of the barn. It was decided by the voters in the townwide election. We are considering in what manner to regulate the marijuana establishments, and that's what these articles are all about. Mr. Sainer and Rabbi Touretz, would you please come forward and sit in the front row?
Good evening. Paul Sainer, Precinct 13, Co-Chair of the Economic Development Advisory Board. Paul Sainer, Precinct 13, Co-Chair. Will someone help me with this? Okay, I'm Paul Sainer. I'm the Co-Chair of the town's Economic Advisory Board, Precinct 13 Town Meeting Member. EDAB held a public hearing on this warrant article. We voted 6-0-2 in favor of the suite of articles other than 19, which was no action. And there were three reasons that we focused on, this being a new business opportunity with 60% endorsement from the town's voters in our ever-changing local business economy. Secondly, whether the enhanced regulations, in particular in Article 17, gave us the conviction that this would have benign impacts on our commercial areas. And lastly, the possibility of, as Chairman Wyszynski mentioned the other night, additional revenue streams for the town. And in this case, we didn't attempt to quantify that for such a nascent industry, but we were heartened that likely whatever the taxes were from Article 22 would drop to the bottom line of the town, given the outstanding job that Town Administrator Kleckner did negotiating a community host agreement that covers the town's incremental public safety and public health costs. Our retail areas are evolving. We're certainly not insulated from internet sales. EDAB certainly is encouraged by the potential of retail marijuana being a draw to our commercial areas, with the potential of a multiplier effect, consumers spending money not just on retail marijuana as they make their procurements in our commercial districts. Our primary focus was the enhanced regulations, and I want to call several of those to your attention that we camped on heavily. One is our concern over concentration, and as Ms. Hyatt alluded to, the bylaws address that by limiting the number of establishments, and also requiring distances between the establishments. We were highly focused on the impact that this use might have on the fabric of our commercial neighborhoods. And in particular, we wanted to make sure that the pedestrian-oriented scale that's very favorable to smaller businesses would be preserved, and therefore we were very supportive of the overall cap on the size of the stores, which applies to all districts, and in particular limits ground floor space to no more than to less than 3,500 square feet. The other things that I want to mention relating to Article 17 are that unlike any other retail use, there's a requirement prior to applying for a special permit that there be a 45-day period for the town staff to do a comprehensive review of a site plan, and in particular to focus on nuisances. We all sort of look the other way on Sunday when we're in our commercial areas and see customers overflowing on the sidewalk from some of our beloved brunch places, but that's obviously not going to be acceptable for this type of use. And so this site planning is a very significant component of the overall structuring to protect our commercial neighborhoods. And I will also point out that baked into special permit provisions unusually are public safety concerns around security and emergency response. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the TMMA list, contrasting the characteristics of our general business versus our local business districts. I think it's a very tough thing to generalize. So as an example, there are retail uses in our L districts that are draws. There are a number of local merchants in our general business districts. I remember Harry Boers, when he spoke from this podium as chair of the advisory committee, often talking about our commercial neighborhoods being cheek and jowl with our residential neighborhoods. And in fact, in many instances, they're mixed use. They're on top of one another. So I think it's not so wise to make such broad generalizations. There's a concern over, I guess, the multiplier effect in particular in the local business districts, potentially causing longer-term rents to increase. That might also cause a greater propensity on the part of commercial landlords to invest in their properties, which in particular, given the way some of them look in our local districts, would be a positive. In the near term, if there is a multiplier effect, it might actually inure to the benefit of our cherished mom and pop merchants that are struggling to make ends meet, so that if there's additional commerce near their stores as a result of medical marijuana, it might, recreational marijuana, it might actually help them. In closing, as the other speakers have indicated, regardless of your position on the L districts being included or not, please vote for Article 17, because otherwise we only have the state regs, which are completely inadequate. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and urge favorable action on all of the warrant articles and no action on warrant Article 19, for the obvious reason that limiting the number of stores will tend to concentrate the stores in a greater location. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, I have a question.
Rabbi Touretz?
Mr. Moderator, could I ask a question just to follow up to that?
I'll
Something
tell
that
you
was
when
just
you
said.
can. We'll reach a Q&A period at some point, but not quite yet.
My name is Alan Turitz. I hope I didn't just wake you. I've been the rabbi at Temple Emeth in Putnam Circle, South Brookline, since 1977. And when I became aware of what you're considering, I first of all investigated as carefully as I could a very renowned article in the Colorado Springs Gazette in November 2017, which marked an anniversary since the passage of the amendment which allowed recreational marijuana in Colorado. And I was told that this is a fairly even-tempered and even-minded newspaper, and reported only in terms of the statistics that were available to them. And they suggested what I might call the laws of unintended consequences. They said that with the use of the marijuana permitted over the years, that there was, number one, reported by the directors of homeless shelters, an increase in homeless presence seeking marijuana of a very significant proportion. The article detailed that double the number of fatal crashes of drivers who tested positively for marijuana, I don't know how they test for it, but there is a test, was also reported. They mentioned that there was also far more marijuana in schools and drug violations, an increase in high school use, and also in criminal activity. Now, I believe and understand the law that has legalized marijuana in the Commonwealth, and I understand it. I also feel very strongly, particularly about the Wisniewski article forbidding it in the L districts, that there is a huge amount to support that, not only because of what I read and experienced in terms of Colorado, but in terms of the appropriateness of L districts, which I believe are not as easily able to handle potential problems as well as general commercial districts can. Putnam Circle itself, and I speak for this L district, although others have their concerns as well, is a very sequestered kind of a neighborhood. It contains within it, not only Temple Emeth happens to be across the street, but it also has the Baker School. It has Chabad with a very large following, many teenagers. We house at Temple Emeth BEEP, Brookline Early Education. We're delighted to have these children, these wonderful parents, and these superb teachers. And I think one of the reasons that they are comfortable is they feel very safe in the environment of this single home, neighborly neighborhood. My concern is that there are things that Colorado suggests that could take place, despite all that you've been told by people who have far more technical expertise in this series of articles than I do. But I have been part of this neighborhood for over 40 years. I'm very familiar with it. I'm familiar with the Basili family and how beautifully and meticulously they maintain Putnam Circle and the Putnam shops, which do what seems to me beautifully and have a very, very loyal clientele. Both myself, many of my congregants, many of the people who live in the district. I attended a local meeting where there was unanimous sensibility against L districts being part of this, as the Wisniewski article suggests. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Where is Mr. Wisniewski?
Yes.
Is that over here? Nice to see you. I just must at least pronounce the man's name right. Thank you. I woke you up. I'm sorry. I apologize. I do that when I speak Saturdays as well. I'm
You
used
have
to
1
it.
minute, sir.
And my feeling is very strong, as is that of my colleague Rabbi Ullman, who has a very large following, that we have many teenagers. They often will leave services or events and go across the street to Putnam. They usually go to Starbucks, they get together at the Chinese restaurant, etc. I once said that Golden Temple trumps Temple Emeth. People love Chinese restaurants. I understand that. But the nature of the neighborhood seems inappropriate. I don't think that the kind of problems that Colorado described are problems that we can handle in the L district as well as a general commercial district can handle. And I understand as well that there is a selection about no social consumption. I empathize and understand that, but it's yours
30
that really
seconds, sir.
strikes me most. And I will conclude by saying the following. I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel strongly. I respect every area. I know that all of you are concerned that things be right no matter which area you're in. And I'm a democratic thinker. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about humanistically. I want every area to flourish. And I'll finish by simply suggesting two things. Number one, our sages say, Ezuhu chacham haro'et hanolad. Who is wise? He who can foresee the outcome of a new venture. I'm not sure it's clear enough as to the outcome of this new venture to easily include L districts, and for that matter, to be cautious, as one of the speakers before me suggested, about how to handle what could be the outcome of these decisions. And my final comment is, I was given 2 tickets to a front row seat for Game 7 with the Celtics and Cavaliers. I hope I never have to use them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Waschinsky?
Oh, this is not projecting well, so you're going to have to bear with me. Even muddier. Okay, well, we'll manage. So I'm Neil Waschinsky. I am speaking for myself, not the Select Board for a change, in support of the motion offered by myself and 5 other town meeting members to not permit storefront marijuana retailers in L districts. So first, I'd like to just acknowledge some extraordinary staff support that we've received from our planning staff, Ashley Clark, Francisco Torres, and also from our legal staff, led by Patty Correa. So please give them a round of applause. So we've been talking about L districts, and I thought it would be a good idea to show you the L districts. So first, what is an L district? What does our zoning bylaw say an L district is? It says it's intended to primarily serve the local retail business needs of the residents of the vicinity, or primarily serve local needs. Now, most of these districts were designated Ls many years ago, and that designation may still be valid or not. Some of them aren't. So, for example, there is an L district, which is actually right around there, that is covered by one of the buffer zones, which is the Stop and Shop. Stop and Shop is an L district, but we don't have to worry about that with respect to the marijuana because it's within one of the school buffer zones. So, starting at the top of the town, St. Mary's, we have Kennedy Crossing coming down here, right when you enter Brookline on Beacon Street. That's the CVS. Over here is Kirkman's Market, that area, and Kendall Crescent, which is now a residential area, which is now residential. It was zoned L when it was the town garage, but it hasn't been the town garage in 20-something years. So that's, and then you have Putterham Circle. Down, oh, the moderator's blocking me from Putterham Circle. So this is what's left over when you remove the L districts. So you have, these are the G's and the I's. So they come along Beacon Street. This is Washington Square. Route 9, okay, sorry. This is Chestnut Hill. I do know the town. This is 850 Boylston Street. And then here's Washington Square, Coolidge Corner, Commonwealth Avenue, and then Brookline Village. So that's what we're talking about. That's the delta. That's what's left over. And then we asked planning staff to estimate the number of establishments that this is just given taking into account the zoning dimensions. How many of these marijuana establishments can each of these zones handle? So you see in the commercial area it says total 22 to 37. That's not the real number. The real number is really the viable number. The viable number takes into account the fact that most of Commonwealth Avenue, for example, is owned by BU, and BU isn't going to rent to these establishments.
1 minute.
Oh, gosh. So.
All right, 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So plenty of opportunity to space these establishments in all of our major commercial districts. And what I've heard it said is we should allow these establishments wherever we allow package stores and bars. To me, the better question to ask is, where do we allow medical marijuana dispensaries? We have experience with those, and we don't allow those in L districts yet. Why should we allow recreational establishments in L districts when in all likelihood they will be more impactful than medical dispensaries? To me, the prudent course is to go slow, and then if our experience is good, open it up further. I urge you to vote for both the Select Board motion on Article 17 plus the so-called Wyszynski motion, which together will not permit storefront and social consumption retail establishment in L districts. Before I end, I'd like to say a couple of words about Article 19, the Frawley motion. The motion would reduce the maximum number of storefront, delivery, and social consumption retailers to 3 each, down from the current 4. And since Brookline voters approved the marijuana ballot question, it would also trigger the need for a referendum on the general ballot. I'm told that this could be as soon as September or in November. Having helped run a number of townwide elections and referendums, I know how much work is involved, including the need to raise money, enlist volunteers, print and mount lawn signs. You get the picture. And for what? To reduce the number of establishments from 4 to 3? It seems hardly worth the effort. Therefore, I urge you to vote no action on Article 19. In summary, please vote favorable action on whatever version of Article 17 becomes the main motion, even if the L District motion doesn't pass, and then all the other marijuana articles except Article 19.
Thank you, Mr. Heiken.
Steve Heiken for the Planning Board. The Planning Board's focus of the numerous marijuana articles has been on Article 17, which is the zoning-related article that was submitted by the Planning and Community Development Department and which provides changes to the zoning bylaw related to marijuana establishments. We unanimously support Article 17. In our review of the bylaw and the various proposed amendments, we have tended to take a relatively expansive and liberal view of the locational regulations of the bylaw and the proposed modifications to those regulations. In our hearings on this matter, we also noted broad public support for the implementation of retail sales of marijuana. For instance, we support the Advisory Committee's motion to allow retail establishments within the 500-foot buffer zone, where portions of those buffer zones are on the opposite side of the 3 major arteries, being Comm Ave, Beacon Street, and Route 9. In fact, although it's not before you, the Planning Board talked about supporting the notion that on those major arteries, we would be willing to accept retail sales on either side of those streets, even within those buffer zones. We also support retaining the permission for retail establishments within the L local business districts as proposed in the original article and still supported by the Advisory Committee. And although it hasn't come up, we have looked at the possibility of allowing establishments in the few office districts in town. There are 2 in particular on the south side of Route 9. One was just mentioned, 850 Boylston near Reservoir Road, another one on Tully Street. Both of those areas provide sufficient parking, which has been one of the concerns about where these establishments are allowed. I would also point out that the zoning for local business districts limits the size of any individual store to 5,000 square feet, which is consistent with the size that we are allowing local retail establishments. Our reasoning for these broader, this broader view of these allowable locations, I think you've heard similar views from others. Narrowing the allowable locations, we think, even with only a few retail establishments permitted, say 4, might result in even those 4 being concentrated in only a few areas. So, as with other recommendations you've heard, we are in favor of seeing those establishments be more geographically dispersed. So finally, we support, talking strictly about Article 17 here, we support Article 17 specifically as updated by the Advisory Committee to modify the buffer zone to allow establishments on opposite sides of our major arteries, but retaining the permission to allow them by special permit everywhere in the L districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey. And Mr. Doughty, would you come forward, please? That is Dennis.
I don't know, am I as tall as Mel? Good evening. My name's Linda Olson-Pelkey, town meeting member from Precinct 2, and I'll be speaking about why I think we should allow retail marijuana in both the local and general business districts, and also against the proposed amendment to Article 19 to lower the number of licenses. With this suite of warrant articles, we are implementing the will of Brookline voters. We can feel confident about that when we consider that almost 30,000 voters went to the polls on November 8th, 2016. That was a 76% voter turnout, and of those voting, 60% favored legalizing recreational marijuana. For comparison, in our most recent local election, about 8,000 people voted, representing just 22% of eligible voters. The proposed Article 19 amendment to lower the number of licenses, if passed, would require another townwide vote. Unlike the vote in 2016, a vote this November or maybe September would likely have a much lower turnout and could result, I contend, in a small, vocal, motivated minority superseding the will of the majority of Brookline voters. Given the strong vote in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana, town staff and our boards and commissions have done a great job balancing opportunities for new businesses with careful regulation. As the map shows, which we saw before, I hope you guys still love maps, the 500-foot school buffer zones and the density restrictions will significantly limit the number of potential sites. The main motion allows for a total of 4 retail shops to locate in either the local or general business districts. These areas are shown on the map, with green being the general and light orange is the local. So what's currently allowed in our local business districts? Retail stores, packaged liquor stores, restaurants and bars, banks, services, animal daycare, gas stations, etc. are all allowed if they are 5,000 square feet or less in size. Article 17 would add 4 types of marijuana businesses to that list, namely retail shops, social consumption, delivery only, retail, and cultivators. The main difference between the two business zones, local and general, is the maximum square footage size allowed. The L, as we've heard, is 5,000 square feet, while in the G, it's 10,000 square feet. Article 17 has an additional size limit with only 3,500 square feet being allowed on the first floor. Therefore, retail marijuana shops will be compatible in scale and use with other L district businesses. At the January public hearing that I attended on these regulations, there were many young people there who were eager to start new businesses. We've heard a lot about wanting to protect our residential areas from retail marijuana shops. However, a more nuanced look at our G districts reveal that many multifamily residents are located next to and within our G districts. This map shows Harvard Street, just south of Beacon, where Sewell veers off. This is just one example of the typical mix of uses in and around our commercial areas, with residential and business uses right next to each other. While it's unclear what impacts we are protecting residential areas from, it's not really accurate to say that if we eliminate the L districts, we're protecting residential areas. I'd like to point out that, as we heard before a business owner can even apply for a special permit, there is a site plan review process. And I think that this process will be sufficient to limit the chances of unsuitable sites going forward with permitting. I'm going to skip the part about what it takes to allow social consumption businesses because Select Board Member Green already told us that. So why should you vote no on the Select Board and the Wyszynski amendment, and yes on the main motion, thereby keeping the option of having retail marijuana in both the L and G districts? Because voting yes will help us avoid concentrating marijuana businesses in our already congested G business zones. Voting yes will allow for more potential sites for new business opportunities. Voting yes will disperse any possible rent impacts from increased demand by dispersing that demand. The size and use of the proposed retail shops are compatible with L District's purpose and existing businesses, and there are residential areas in and near both business zones. Limiting shops to the G districts won't slow down the rollout, it just concentrates it. There will still be the same number of licenses available. And to address the rationale that the Select Board gave for wanting to exclude social consumption from the L districts, I would just say that proximity to a transportation mode does not restrict or enable responsible use. And actually, more local shops are more walkable shops. There's a strong public support throughout Brookline for legal recreational marijuana. So please vote yes on Article 17 and no on the 2 amendments. And also, please vote no on the Frawley Amendment to Article 19. Having another townwide vote on the number of licenses would be very confusing and could result in a vocal minority superseding the will of the majority of Brookline voters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dennis Doughty, Precinct 3, member of the Advisory Committee, but not speaking for the Advisory Committee. I'd like to address a concern that I haven't actually heard expressed tonight, but I heard many times during the public hearings for these warrant articles. And that was the concern that expanding establishments throughout the town, but in particular in the L districts, might lead to an increase in crime in those districts. We heard many statements of the form, it's an all-cash business, this could be a lightning rod for robberies, concerns to that effect. But we have experience with Netta in Brookline Village for 2 years now, and I reached out to the police department asking for crime statistics, and I'd like to share them with you. Over the past, and I was particularly interested in the serious crimes, so-called Part A crimes, which include things like murder, rape, robbery, but also assault, burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft. And over the past 2+ years, there have been 2 Part A crimes reported at Netta. But during the same time period, Brookline High School had 31. There were 17 at the senior housing at 99 Kent Street, 15 at the Gap. The Wine Gallery and the Washington Square Tavern contributed another 4, and don't get me started on Trader Joe's and TJ Maxx. The police department reports, and I quote, "When comparing these hot spots to those occurring at Netta during the same time frame, the criminal offenses at Netta are statistically insignificant." So I believe that alarmist rhetoric crumbles when it meets the statistical reality, and I would encourage, like so many before me, favorable action on warrant Article 17, the advisory committee motion, favorable action on 18, no action on 19, favorable action on the rest. Thank you.
Mr. Nerl? Mr. Nerl? And after we hear from Mr. Nerl, we'll have a Q&A period for those of you who wish to ask questions, notwithstanding the comprehensible and comprehensive explanations that you've already heard. Mr. Nerl.
Thank you. Anthony Narrow, Precinct 5. On the Wyszynski motion, 13 of 15 P5 town meeting members support that motion to limit marijuana retail and other licenses to general business districts for the time being, and not permit them in local business districts. One member was undecided, and one member we could not get input from. Some members in favor of this motion are open to the idea that down the road, the topic of marijuana retail businesses in L districts should be revisited after the town is able to see how the industry operates statewide, and more importantly, in our town. Other members have expressed concern that limiting business opportunities to only general districts may shut out smaller mom and pop shops and may negatively impact the diversity of business owners. And I join in both of those sentiments. However, the 13 P5 members feel that for now, L districts must not be included in the new zoning bylaw. This is not forever, but we're just starting out. Speaking for myself, I would say that the will of the people was not to destroy local business districts. We don't know what the legal recreational market will look like. We don't know the demand and what the negative consequences, if any, from that demand may be. We need to see how these businesses impact the general business districts so that we can study the issue of allowing this industry to come into our local business districts and craft intelligent zoning bylaws that will protect the integrity of the local business districts as well as the neighborhoods in which they exist. This is not NIMBYism. Precinct 5, as you all know, we have Netta right down the street from us with Precinct 6. It's going to be one of the largest and most profitable dispensaries in the state, in my opinion. This is about exercising reasonable caution. As we all know, general business districts are mixed. There are residential areas. But as the rabbi had observed, they are more equipped to handle the impact of this new industry. Why put that on the local business districts now? Why rush? Why not use caution? On Ms. Frawley's motion, in the morning perhaps, it was originally one license per type of business model. 13 of the 15 town meeting members did not support that motion, but as amended, it now allows 3, so there was no way to build a consensus one way or the other. So I will speak for myself. I think the town needs to be aware of the danger of creating a marijuana district in our town, and I'm specifically referring to Brookline Village. Brookline Village is a beloved section of our wonderful town. We don't want to lose its character by having a concentration of marijuana businesses located therein. There will be positive economic benefits to having these businesses, thus strategically placing these businesses throughout the town not only will help preserve the integrity of all of our various general business districts, but it will also help promote an equal distribution of economic benefits throughout the town. A concentration of this industry in our town, again, specifically I'm referring to Brookline Village with limited parking, heavy pedestrian traffic, will promote further motor vehicle traffic congestion. This will create a negative impact on the quality of life in the area and a result in an increase in carbon emissions from those motor vehicles sitting in traffic. Too much green is not green. Nothing? I thought that was pretty funny. There we go.
1 minute.
Thank you. There are likely a number of other concerns that I've yet to think of, but I think we need to be mindful of this as the industry takes shape in our community. It is an opportunity, but it can also be a curse. Thank you.
Mr. Bassett?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Bassett, Precinct 6. I've been told by Town Council's office that if we do not pass Article 17, that we are still in a moratorium which lasts until the end of this year, and that therefore we are not instantly at the mercy of the state regulations. I'm suggesting that we vote no on Article 17 and have a chance to get it better. I'm concerned about clustering. Mr. Narrow has just mentioned Brookline Village. Ms. Hyatt said that they're given the 200-foot minimum dimension. There could be 4 or 5 in Brookline Village with the ambiguity, and it is an ambiguity which need not exist, as to whether you're talking 200 feet between like shops, between 2 storefront shops, or 200 feet between, so let's say, a storefront shop and a social consumption. That in Brookline Village there could be not 4 or 5, but maybe 8 or 10. The way to, well, I don't want a cluster in Brookline Village, and the way to ensure spreading in more parts of the town to avoid clustering is to increase the minimum distance between shops. I suggest we vote no on, no action on Article 17, come back in November and get this otherwise pretty good set of articles right on the minimum distance between shops. I'm suggesting voting only no action on Article 17. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hochleitner?
So just to follow up on that point, I guess...
Who are you?
Brian Hochleitner, Precinct 6. I heard a couple of speakers say that if we don't vote yes on some form of Article 17, that we lose control. And I'm just looking at the combined reports, page 1717, which points out that under Mass General Laws, Chapter 40A, Section 5, upon voting, the zoning bylaw would take effect. And so in November town meeting, approving a different version of a zoning bylaw would still be timely. And I guess I'm just wondering, whether that's a possibility.
Yes, Ms. Correa.
Hi, Patty Correa from Town Council's office. As it was a long series of warrant articles. What we tried to explain was we do have the moratorium. It is in effect until the end of the year. If there is a no vote, we have what exists on the books, which is the moratorium. However, we wanted the fallback of having a vote on 17 and a ZBL in case for some reason the moratorium is challenged. It is probably the case that the Cannabis Commission will honor the moratorium. That wasn't clear when we filed the warrant articles, but there still could be a challenge, and so it's rock solid to have a vote. So that's what we were recommending. Thank you.
Mr. Burstein?
Sorry, just a follow-up question. What would be the basis for challenging the moratorium?
As I understand it, and I've been at conferences where I've heard this, there are industry-side attorneys who argue that to have a ban, you need a townwide referendum, and a moratorium is like a ban. That's the argument.
Even a temporary one?
I'm just saying what the argument is. Yes, that's the
yeah.
argument. I'm just saying what lawyers are saying on behalf of the industry.
Mr. Burstein?
Thank you. Michael A. Burstein, Precinct 12. As Select Board Member Green put it, this is a convoluted issue, and I don't know if there's an actually simple answer to my question, but I throw it out there. In my world, I would like to see marijuana in the smokable form basically treated and regulated as tobacco, marijuana as something that one would consume being regulated and treated as alcohol. And I guess the question I would have would be, is it possible to be guided on these articles as how one would vote to get something as close to that ideal as possible? I don't know if anyone has an easy way to answer that question, but that's just my perspective on it.
Thank you for your perspective. Ms. Khan?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Janice Khan, Precinct 15. So I actually have a question not on 17, but more on 18. With the Select Board as the licensing agency, I'm just wondering how neighborhood input would affect decision-making. This is not a 40B where we have no say. I would assume that the Select Board actually have some discretionary input in terms of figuring out whether this kind of facility would be appropriate, which is sort of my understanding of why voting to exclude L districts may not in fact be necessary if we have the Select Board who have criteria and ways of dealing with neighborhood input.
Ms. Carrillo?
Thank you. I think you should think about the liquor licensing approach as the template for how this would be handled in the Select Board licensing context for this type of thing. So you have criteria. The criteria are set out in the bylaw. There could be specific concerns about specific sites, and as what happens with liquor license applications, and as happened with the NETA application for the medical, there were specific site concerns that were addressed through license conditions, for example. So that would be the tailored process. And of course, the applicant would have to show, as with any license applicant, they're suitable, they're responsible, they have a responsible manager, all those sorts of criteria.
And I have a follow-up question, which is, the bylaw right now says that the license would be reviewed after a year, same as liquor licenses.
Yes.
But I was wondering if there is a procedure in place also, say, of something opens and there is a lot of neighborhood concern, whether that license would be reviewed earlier than a year, or?
So what would happen is with any license, on occasion there are complaints to the Select Board's office about a licensee, and those complaints are investigated to determine if there's been some sort of violation, and if there has been, the licensee can be called in for a violation hearing and it can be addressed that way.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Karen?
John Karen, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12. My question, I think, is for my good friend, Mr. Wyszynski, or
Why don't you
one of the
ask it and we'll decide.
Okay. Well, as I understand the Wyszynski amendment, it would exclude marijuana dispensaries and consumption facilities from L districts. And I believe, if I followed Mr. Wyszynski's presentation, that two of the L districts that would be excluded, one of them is the St. Mary's area, another one is JFK Crossing. And Precinct 12, where I live, includes where I live, which is Washington Square. And as I understand it, the rationale for excluding L districts from having dispensaries is that the general business districts, like Washington Square, are better able to absorb the impacts of marijuana facilities. And my question is this: what makes Washington Square better able to absorb the impact of marijuana facilities compared to either JFK Crossing or St. Mary's? Because I really see no qualitative difference except our restaurants are better.
Mr. Wyszynski.
I think what you're pointing out is the notion that not all L districts are created equal. And I've been thinking for a while, and been saying privately, and now I'll say publicly, that we need to take a good hard look at our L districts and ask ourselves, are they appropriately zoned? So you have JFK Crossing and St. Mary's, but you also have, as an L district, where Kirkman's is, where Clearflower Bakery is, Putterham. We can argue, should that be L? I would say yes, but I don't have a better answer for you than that.
If I could just have a follow-up on that, and I appreciate your good faith and our disagreement, but is there another way that this could be addressed? Because it strikes me that the amendment you're proposing takes some sites that are equally suitable off the table and also increases the anxiety, which I think is well-founded, of my good friends in Precinct 6, that they're going to end up with all of the marijuana facilities over in their neighborhood. And if there was another way, there may be some L neighborhoods that are inappropriate for it, but it seems like maybe we're painting with a little too broad a brush on this one.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any, L districts are a vehicle in the zoning code that we have a hook and can grab onto. And if the L districts are not appropriately zoned, then,
No, I understand the constraints.
Can't do anything with
I
this
understand the
context.
constraints you're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bernard, is it?
No.
No? Who are you?
Beth Cates from Precinct 9. I have a question about cannabis marketing. I have seen the way recreational marijuana has presented itself in both Colorado and California. And I didn't see any guidelines in any of the warrant articles for advertising or vans that might have advertising on them or things like that. regarded, that might be in this town or passing through this town. I have to say that I appreciate the discrete presentation that Netta has, and I would like to see that as appropriate throughout this town, but I don't know, are there going to be guidelines for marketing of cannabis?
Yes. The Cannabis Commission has promulgated very detailed regulations on this subject that it's essentially borrowed from the medical marijuana context. So the very discrete presence that you see with NETA is compliant with those new set of regulations that are modeled after the medical regulations. We also have a town sign bylaw. So there'll be very similar kinds of regulations in effect for recreational.
Does that cover motor vehicles?
Yes, I don't believe they're allowed to. If I recall, I don't think the regulations permit advertising on vehicles, if I recall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gilman.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. Mr. Moderator, I have two questions of fact. One is how the penalties are set. I noted that there's a $100 penalty assessed for the first occasion or something. I'm just curious how that's set.
Set by bylaw.
It's set by bylaw.
So how does this, you guys rehearsed that, didn't you? So how does this compare with alcohol establishment violations or restaurant establishment violations?
So the general bylaws have fee schedules for fines. There isn't so that is one way. The liquor laws may have other vehicles for fines. I don't recall offhand.
Thank you. I'd also like to understand, we have laws that prohibit smoking in restaurants and so forth. Will the marijuana laws pertain to smoking laws, or will they be allowed to smoke? Can people smoke anywhere?
We wrote into the warrant articles before you language that is modeled after the town's smoking bylaw, which does not permit smoking in public restaurants and places like that. So there could be other types of consumption if social consumption operation is adopted by the town, but not smoking because of the smoking bylaw.
Thank you.
Thank you. On my left.
Hey, Brian Bergstein, Precinct 6. I apologize if the answer to this actually is in the combined reports, but I'm not seeing it. I want to understand this 500-foot, with exceptions on the sort of major thoroughfares, the buffer from schools. So it's pretty understandable that a marijuana business cannot be within 500 feet of a school, but does that buffer apply in reverse? So, the locations of schools are changing, or we might put new schools eventually in town. I'm thinking about how during the Devotion renovations, part of the school moved temporarily to a totally new location. They're on Webster Street. So what happens if someone wants to open up a private school, or there is a good location for the 9th school or 10th or whatever, and it's within this 500 feet zone? What happens? Is the school not allowed there? Does the marijuana business lose? How would that work?
Mr. Torres.
Hi, Francisco Torres, town planner. So the decision would be made by the building commissioner at the time the application is submitted. So if the marijuana facility is already in place and operating, and a school would move within that 500-foot buffer, that facility would be grandfathered.
So in other words, it would still be possible to have a school in that zone?
In this scenario, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Mr. Davis.
Jonathan Davis, Precinct 10. Mr. Moderator, I have two questions. The first question is, I think it's the answer is pretty obvious, but I just wanted to pose it to hear the answer, and that is, assuming that Article 17 in one form or another were to pass tonight, is there anything that prevents town meeting from coming back in the November special town meeting, to enact further or modifying zoning changes? I think it's a pretty obvious answer, but I think it bears hearing.
Well, the obvious answer is that our bylaws are always subject to further amendment by town meeting.
Okay, thank you. Second question, would any of the staff persons here just explain a little bit how the 200-foot minimum limitation would apply between retail marijuana storefronts and another retail marijuana storefront?
Yeah, Mr. Torres?
Hello, my name is Ashley Clark, and I'm a planner in the planning department. They're the same. So you can't be within 200 feet from any kind of marijuana retail establishment.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hello, Joel Feingold, Precinct 1, on Beacon Street, in the middle of the block between St. Mary's and Carlton, so very familiar with what is, I think, incorrectly referred to as a local business district, but is nonetheless an L district. So I thought about a series in honor of the rabbi's presence of asking the 4 questions like on Passover, but I just can't do that. So 4 comments with a question instead. The first comment is, I think that what we've heard from a number of speakers tonight, and don't take personal offense, although you might, I think it's a little bit of fear-mongering. We've heard this a few times. I don't think it's appropriate at all. Through my work, my industry, and my past life before I quit drugs when I was 30, I have a lot of experience with people that use drugs. What can I tell you? Being in the entertainment industry, most of my clients are marijuana users. A lot of business gets done in bars and restaurants by my corporate clients, and they're drinking and smoking cigars and stuff like that. I think that we should be much more sanguine about the transition we're going through than we have been. All the stuff about it's 200 feet or 500 feet, that's really getting lost in the weeds. Yeah, that was unintentional, by the way. That's getting lost. That's good, though. It's getting lost in the weeds when, if you have a school, the high school, it's surrounded by houses, and there's lots of pot smokers in those houses. It's just, we're making this crazy, and Article 17's pretty good. We'll talk about the LBS districts. It's just no big deal. If you want to get specific about it, the St. Mary's district has 3 destination restaurants. People drive to them from all over the place to go to Taberna de Haro and Gyokoku and Szechuan Gourmet. It's not a local business district. People come to it. At the Busy Bee, right, where we saw each other at lunch today. I mean, so that is a local restaurant, by the way. And by the way, the reason there aren't parking spaces there is because the staff from the Busy Bee uses them for their own parking every day and feed the meter. So, but yeah, we don't have to go there. So I'm just saying there's social consumption all around us. We really don't have to fret about that. The last thing that I would ask, and get the point I'd make, and this is what I'm kind of getting to, is won't we see a situation if we limit this to G districts where all the licenses are issued, and then that will be a de facto concentration of the spaces? And because L districts right now can be presumed to have lower rents, it will shut out some folks that don't have the economic resources to go into the G districts. So I would say, aren't we denying a certain element of social justice, which was written into the Massachusetts law, if we eliminate the L districts? So that's kind of my question.
I think we'll take that as a comment, Mr. Feingold. I think you've heard arguments on both sides of that question.
Thank you very much
yes, sir.
for the time, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ilan Wapinski, Precinct 7. So a lot of the concern people have had is that there's a lot of the potential of a kind of a marijuana district or a concentration of a lot of marijuana establishments in the Brookline Village area, and the potential traffic or nuisances that might incur. And I think part of that might be because of the existing establishment that's there, that's probably the largest and most popular provider in eastern Massachusetts currently. So my question is whether, if anyone can answer this, is as more establishments get created and open up, not just in Brookline, but in abutting neighborhoods or towns, does anyone know of the plans of abutting towns for opening marijuana establishments, what the restrictions there are, or how, say, Boston or Newton or other towns that are near us are tackling this issue?
Mr. Torres?
Thank you, Francisco Torres, Town Planner. So the only other density requirement that we've heard of so far is that the city of Boston has instituted a half-mile density distance between one establishment from another.
Half a mile?
Half a mile, yeah.
Okay, so can I have a follow-up question? So my understanding was that the minimum separation from one establishment from the other would have been 200 feet?
That's right.
That's right. So
between retailers.
Between retailers, but in Boston, they're choosing half a mile between retailers.
May I answer the question?
Yeah, sure.
We spoke with the planners in the city of Boston, and they took a different approach. They are a city council form of government and have a different citing process through the zoning bylaw.
I'm well aware, yeah.
Sure. And so what they have said is that their attempt to spread them out a lot is to institute this half-mile density and force them to spread out, which you would imagine that would do in such a small space. But that by the time they have so many have located there, that they would apply for a variance to then locate anywhere in between. So the half-mile density might not be
I see.
as strong.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Frawley?
Just a point of clarification.
Who are you?
I don't know.
I think we all know.
Regina Frawley, Precinct 16. You need to tell me. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Real quick question. Chair Wyszynski said that there was no big deal between 3 and 4, not worth the trouble of having a referendum. Isn't it true it's actually 5 because we have the potential for 5? Is that not accurate?
That's accurate.
Number 1, number 2?
It's 4 right now. If we grant
Because of the
liquor
extent.
licenses that we're permitted to, it'll be 5.
But they could have 5 in no time, that people could come in for the remaining 6 out of the 24 off-premise licenses. Is that not true?
Yes.
That was a nod. Okay, thank you. And then I think it's up to us to decide what is worth our while. Thank you.
Mr. Gladstone?
Thank you. Scott Gladstone from Precinct 16, also co-sponsor of the Wyszynski Amendment. So I'm not going to monger fear. I'm just going to suggest that this is a social experiment, and we don't know what the outcome of that experiment is. Any good experiment is going to start with a smaller sample before you start with the largest sample, and then we can study the data and see where it goes. This is no perfect way to choose who the guinea pigs are. As good as way as any is to say, okay, the general districts and not the L districts. I understand that some parts of some L districts might be perfectly appropriate for it. Other parts of the other L districts I think are inappropriate for it, including Putterham. But if we're going to take an incremental approach, which I think we should, then the wise way to do it is to vote for the Wyszynski Amendment, and I would even support the Regina Frawley motion. Now, here's the reason that this is critical in going in increments. It's easy to add later. It's impossible to take away later if we found we've made a mistake. Leases are entered into, establishments get in there, then they're grandfathered in. We heard that in another context. So in conclusion, if I could read my note to myself, darn it. All we're saying is we're not taking away anyone's rights. I love movies. There's one movie theater in Brookline. It's hard for me to get to, schlepping from South Brookline, but I do it because I love it. If we have 3 around town, that's a lot. And if it works out fine, we can expand it more later. We cannot contract it if we find that before, here, this is the point, I have forgotten. Before the novelty runs out, wears off. At first, the novelty is people are going to come in. There's only one every half mile in Boston. So that means that the closest neighborhood to West Roxbury with a potential site, if the L districts are in, might be Putterham. That's a lot of people pouring in. So all I'm saying is, let's go incremental, because it's going to be very, very hard to go backwards. Thank you.
Well, more accurately, Mr. Gladstone, we can't reduce or go backwards, as you say, without protecting rights that have been vested in the meantime.
But exactly my point, Mr. Moderator.
Okay.
Thanks.
Ms. Cavell?
I'll pay you later.
I think this is a question I'm Kathleen Cavell from Precinct 1, and I won't crack a lot of jokes like Joel did, but I do think it's important to focus on the point that the previous speaker just made about you can't go backwards. I think the point that all the licenses may be taken up before local districts are included in the universe of districts that are eligible for these locations. So I think that cuts two ways. But I also am wondering, and it didn't come up when Attorney Correa was asked about penalties, but is it not the case that an operator who does not operate properly and who violates some of our rules would not get their license renewed in the annual renewal cycle? Isn't that true?
That's certainly true.
It's true for liquor licenses, and so I assume it's true for these.
Too.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ananian?
Thank you very much. I've got 3 quick questions, which might seem to be on all sides of the issue, but so I do.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Scott Nanny, and I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 10. So I agree with the sentiment expressed by a couple of people, so I won't elaborate further, that the slow start is illusory unless you either support 19 or oppose 17. 4 licenses is not that many, 2 of which have been suggested might end up in Brookline Village. And so achieving good distribution in the newly added L districts will sort of be pointless if all the licenses are given out by the time we allow in L districts. And following up Mr. Burstein's question, I'd like to ask planning specifically whether bars, liquor stores, and tobacco stores are currently allowed in L districts.
If there's a simple yes or no answer?
Yeah,
Yes.
I believe the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
So if you follow Mr. Bernstein, then that suggests an answer to you. And then the following question I had for planning was, this is a question that was just asked to me recently. I didn't know how to answer. What is a building? So the bylaw prohibits establishments in a building that contains an existing daycare. As it turns out, my son's daycare is 2 doors down from Blue Moon Smoke Shop, and it is a continuous facade, but it's not clear to me at all what same building actually means in this context. Could I get an answer to that? Yeah, well.
Well, give it a shot.
I will try. Ashley Clark, planner with the town. We have a definition for structure, which I could provide you. I don't know how helpful it will be.
Is it?
It's a combination of materials assembled at a fixed location to give support or shelter, such as a building, bridge, trestle, tower, framework, retaining wall, tank, tunnel, tent, stadium, reviewing stand, platform, bin, fence, sign, flagpole, or the like.
What I'm really asking is does it require that there be a common landlord? Are we talking lot boundaries? Are we talking about appearance of a single building? If it's a condo where the single structure is owned by multiple people?
Building Commissioner Dan Bennett is going to come and provide some
Thank you.
better insight than I have.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Oops, sorry.
Can you repeat the question? Dan Bennett, Building Commissioner.
Sorry.
Can you repeat that question, please?
Just for specificity, Blue Moon Smoke Shop is 2 doors down from Golden Chickpea Daycare. They're a continuous facade, but it's not clear to me whether they're a single building because it's not clear what the definition of building is.
I'm not familiar with the
Yes,
business you're
sorry.
speaking to, but the requirement for any marijuana retailer, it has to be within the buildings, behind a wall, inside 4 walls, under a roof, so it will not be anything on the exterior or outside a structure.
But does within the same building as defined in the bylaw mean owned by the same landlord, or does it mean part of the same structure? If it's a condo with multiple owners with the same building, does that separate? Or if it's a strip mall type thing, which we see in L districts, where it looks like one building with each individual shops, but the shops are presumably owned by different people.
Mhm. The 500-foot requirement is property line to property line. The 200-foot requirement is business to business. So it would be a party wall or a firewall, whatever separates that business as defined in the building code.
Sorry, the specific question was the requirement in the bylaw that it not be in the same building, is the exact word, as a existing daycare provider.
Good question. With respect to a strip mall or a long facade, I would make the determination based on the property line. So you could have 4 storefronts on one property that is one building.
Mhm.
And then next door, you could have one building with one storefront on the same property. So it's difficult to explain here. I could certainly talk to you offline on it. But property to property, one building sits on a property. That's
Okay.
why I would make that determination.
Thank you.
All right?
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal.
Yes, thank you, Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9 and co-chair of PAX. I have a lot of respect for the people that are proposing either avoiding the L zones or cutting the number of facilities, and I don't think anybody's fear-mongering, but quite candidly, I think that what I would call it is simply paranoia. And I'm wondering if some of them have been using LSD instead of marijuana. I mean, we've been through this since reefer madness about marijuana. And I had the benefit of having 2 wonderful teachers in law school many years ago. This is late 60s, early 70s. I know, don't look it. One named John Kaplan wrote a book called Marijuana, the New Prohibition. And Herbert Packer wrote The Limits of the Criminal Sanction. And they were 2 of the 3 that inspired me to become a criminal defense lawyer and pointed all the fallacies about marijuana and drug prohibition, which is what it was. So my question, I do have a question for the proponents of either limited numbers or limited zones. Do they have any actual evidence that either of those things would cause a marginal difference in the number of people using marijuana? And I speak as somebody who I did not inhale before getting to law school. I don't remember what happened afterwards, but I did have a daughter who graduated from Brookline High 3 years ago, and I don't think, without commenting on her personally, I don't think any of the kids in Brookline High had any trouble getting marijuana without any zones. So does anyone have any evidence is what I'm asking?
Nope.
Well,
thank you. I'll take that as a no from the moderator.
Actually,
Mr. Nero?
I was going to speak to that, just someone.
Ms. Jonas?
Elisa Jonas, Precinct 16. What I was going to say was I felt a lot like Mr. Feingold and Mr. Rosenthal, and my daughters both used marijuana. I used marijuana in high school. But then I was actually, as I was standing there representing folks at Precinct 8, I happened to speak, for the election, I happened to speak to an addiction expert from Harvard Medical School, and his specialties were marijuana and tobacco. And he gave me quite a mouthful of concern about maximizing the number of locations where marijuana would be sold, that normalization is a big concern for adolescents, that marijuana may be fine when you're 42, but it has significant impacts on the developing brain, at least until you're 22 or 26, and that the more you see marijuana outlets, the more you are going to have adolescents be exposed, and that it increases their usage. He also pointed out that no longer is tobacco a gateway to marijuana, but that marijuana is a gateway to tobacco, which made
Ms.
him doubly
Jonas,
concerned.
this discussion is not about whether marijuana is good or bad.
Yes, it is.
it's
I mean,
going-
it is.
gonna-
It's responding to Mr. Feingold and Mr.
It's
Rosenthal.
going to happen, and the question is how we regulate it.
And how do we minimize it or do we maximize it? And what this addiction expert said was legalization is appropriate, but that doesn't mean we have to maximize the number of locations. If you're an adult, if you're over 21, it is easy for you to be able to get to a marijuana dispensary anywhere in this town. So the need to have more than one may be superfluous. So that's...
Thank you. Well, I have no one left to speak except other than those town meeting members who were at the microphone. I will take the motion for the question. I think this has been a healthy and complete debate. Is there a second? There's a second. It requires a two-thirds vote. Those in favor of terminating debate, calling the question, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries by a two-thirds vote. If there are 7 town meeting members who doubt the count, if you doubt the count, please stand and we'll have an electronic vote. Okay, we'll have an electronic vote. I was wrong before in 1998, so before we take this electronic vote, please press the button in the lower right-hand corner of your handheld device, because sometimes they have they switch off after a certain amount of time. So once again, 1 for yes vote, 2 for no, and 3 for abstain. Yes, this is for calling the question. One means you're in favor of terminating debate. 2 means you're opposed to it. Okay. Time's winding down, so please vote. Will we have a timer eventually? Okay, the motion fails. A lot of you must have changed your minds. Mr. Nero? Oh, Mr. Sandman?
Yes, Mike Sandman, town meeting member from Precinct 3, a member of the advisory committee, speaking for myself, not the advisory committee, asking a question. A lot of this discussion seems to be about whether we should have 3 or 5 allowed establishments allowed in town and where they should be. I wonder if anyone has any estimate as to how many locations one can buy marijuana in now in Brookline, and whether any of them are in L districts. That's not a rhetorical question. If you think about it and you don't have an answer to it, it means you can buy marijuana anywhere now, and legally restricting it to 5 locations, whether in L or G or both, is a very substantial change from the current situation.
Thank you, Mr. Nero.
Thank you, Anthony Nero, Precinct 5. I have one question. I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I would just briefly dissent with what Mr. Salmon just said. It's not about the ability to buy marijuana in the black or gray market. It's about the concentration of the customers into one locale. But my question is this. It just came to me because I know that I'm not in favor of a no vote. I think we should pass something tonight. But for those who may be considering that, is there an anticipated financial cost to not passing these warrant articles, including the loss of tax revenue from projected sales and the cost of litigation from the industry?
Well, I think those are two risks, certainly.
I'm just curious if anyone has thought about what the financial cost of the town would be.
Mr. Wyszynski?
There would, the litigation risk, I have no idea, but there would certainly be a loss of tax revenue, given that NETA has started the application process, and if we delay that 6 months, we would lose X months revenue.
Thank you. And I think we could all agree that litigation would cost the town money as well.
It usually does.
Yeah.
Mr. Lescoyer?
David Lescoyer, Precinct 11. Actually, my question follows that. Are there any estimates for what the tax revenue will be for the town if these warrant articles pass, particularly the advisory committee version?
Mr. Kleckner?
This is Mel Kleckner, Town Administrator. I think as Mr. Sainer mentioned earlier, it's a very early industry. It's really hard to project that. I can only tell you that NETA, which only sells medical marijuana at this time, generated $19.5 million of revenue in 2017. 3% is about $585,000. We anticipate, I think the medical will actually go down, and then of course we'll introduce recreational sales. So we've conservatively estimated $1 million in tax revenue, but I think that's a conservative estimate.
Ms. Daly?
Yes. Nancy Daly, Precinct 12. I just wanted to respond. Ms. Cavell asked a question or made a statement that if a liquor licensee was not behaving well, you could not renew their license, and you, I believe, agreed with her. And I just want to say that in my 12 years on the board, I learned that it is very, very difficult to impose even a harsh penalty, like a number of days closed on a liquor license holder, and next to impossible to get the license away from them because they can appeal a town decision that they don't like to the state ABCC. And I assume that there may be some similar arrangement for these licensees. So you're going to have to expect that once they get the license, it's going to be extremely difficult to claw it back, if that's what you want to do. I also want to say I have read some articles about some situations in California where they had a lot of people kind of hanging out in front of some of their marijuana establishments that was displeasing to the neighborhood. I admit their weather is way better than ours, so it may be more fun to hang out on the sidewalk there, but I think it is something to keep in mind.
Thank you. Ms. Frawley?
Yes, Regina Frawley, Precinct 16. I echo what Nancy Daly just said. Some of us are trying to figure out recently how many licenses have ever been revoked in all the 18 years that I've been going to the Board of Selectmen every Tuesday night, and we could only come up with one. And that was only after they had about 7 attempts to fix it. And when it's revoked, it doesn't mean that you don't have the license. It means that vendor no longer can use it. So it is, once you vote this is almost impossible to reverse. I don't even know how to. That's point one. So I do support what Nancy said. Secondly, there was I believe, a misrepresentation of L districts. They are the last mom and pop stores in town. Their rents are lower. They're usually 1 or 2 stories high. And it's a chance we always claim we like mom and pop stores in Brookline, but it's the L districts that they have a shot at it. And finally, to answer what Michael Sandman asked, 290 communities are not available for pot shops as of this moment. Around 60, you could go find them across Massachusetts. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
It's Nicole McClellan, Precinct 11. Just for a point of clarity to be sure I know exactly what I'm voting for, when we're talking about 4 or 3 licenses, it's multiplied by 4, right? Types of establishment by 3. So for the only amendment that actually limits the number of licenses is the Frawley amendment, correct? So that would be 9. But Wyszynski, I mean, it limits district, but not number.
Would you explain the numbers for us, Mr. Wyszynski?
The social consumption, before that could take effect, would require a referendum, a townwide vote. So that's not going to happen right away. So then that leaves us with the retail stores and the delivery. So it would be, and manufacturing, but
Okay.
no
So-
manufacturing? Just the retail it would just be the retail. So it'd be four retail stores and 4 delivery companies.
And then social consumption, assuming,
Assuming it goes to a townwide vote.
right. And assuming we also get approval from the state legislature for additional package store license, we're really talking about 5 multiplied by 3. Is that right?
At
Right,
maximum.
so 15, right. Right.
15, but really
15,
it's
right.
10 without a referendum, and then the delivery, the delivery is less of an impact on a neighborhood than retail store.
But the only thing before us that limits, that further limits the number is the Frawley, right? Okay, thank you.
But that would have to go, of course, to a referendum.
Thank you. This is Bettina Neufein, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1. I would really like to urge us to make haste slowly with this. If indeed, as my esteemed colleague Marty Rosenthal says, everybody has access in their own homes to marijuana easily today. I'm not sure what the rush is to spread as many establishments as possible, as widely as possible. I think the Wyszynski Amendment and the Frawley Amendment have it right. I think we cannot unring the bell once these establishments are open. I think the impacts on our youth we can only guess at, and I think the risks are substantial. I think addiction is extraordinarily difficult to reverse, as Ms. Margolis ably explained. And I think that we are well advised to exercise caution when the primary interests motivating haste seem to be commercial and financial. And I think that is too high a cost to place upon the fates and futures of our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Susie Roberts, Precinct 2. Very short. I have 2 questions. The first one relates to citing marijuana establishments in office districts, and I know that we on the advisory committee, when we first looked at this, we had assumed that marijuana establishments could go at, for example, 850 Boylston, and I don't remember, but that in fact is not the case, so I was wondering what would need to be done in order for us to be able to cite in office districts. That's my first question. And if it is a warrant article, I would appreciate knowing that. And my second question.
It is. Why don't we answer them one at a time?
Okay.
Ms. Roberts. Sure.
We would need another warrant article.
To be able to cite in office districts.
Correct.
Thank you. My second question is, I'm just wondering if I'm missing something with regard to those people that have been cautioning us to go slowly with regard to the Wyszynski Amendment. I understand going slowly, and if you want to go slowly, then you can vote for the Frawley Amendment, which would then require us to vote as a town to reduce that cap. I do understand that. But with regard to the citing of however many establishments we do end up authorizing, going slowly to me doesn't necessarily mean not citing in L districts, and so I'm just curious about whether I'm missing something about going slowly. The number, I guess my point is the number, and if you want to go slowly, there's no changing the number unless you go for the Frawley
I
Amendment.
think that's correct.
Thank you.
Well, we don't need to, as it happens, because there's no one left at a microphone. So here's what we do. We vote first on Article 17, and we will vote on the Wyszynski Amendment. We will then vote on the Board of Selectmen's Amendment, which I'll explain in a moment. And each of those requires a majority vote. We will then vote on Article 17 as amended or not by the Selectmen and Wyszynski amendments. So first, on the Wyszynski Amendment, which would,
Mr. Moderator?
Yes.
I'd like a recorded vote on all.
are
of
there
the-
35 on all of these motions?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have recorded votes on both amendments and on the main motion. So the Wyszynski motion would prohibit,
Point of order, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, Mr.
Are we
Schwartz?
voting on the advisory committee motion at all?
the main motion is on the rose-colored supplement. It is the motion of the advisory committee.
So that is if the two amendments fail, then we're voting
No,
on...
no, that's the main motion.
Okay, thank you.
And it's sought to be amended in two manners. One by Mr. Wyszynski, which is to prohibit storefront marijuana retailers in L districts, as the main motion permits it by special permit. So this is Article 17, Wyszynski Amendment. Do we have a timer this time? If you favor this amendment, press 1. If you oppose it, press 2. And if you abstain, press 3. Okay, anytime. This is the Wyszynski amendment to the main motion. To eliminate storefront marijuana retailers from L districts. The motion fails by a vote of 84 in favor, 116 against, and 2 abstentions. Next is the Board of Selectmen's motion amendment, which would prohibit social consumption marijuana retailers in L districts. Press 1 if you favor that amendment, 2 if you oppose it, and 3 if you abstain. This is Article 17, SB Amendment. We've got a equipment failure here. Okay, voting period is in process. It's down to the wire, folks. The selectmen are leading by a nose. Motion carries by a vote of 107 in favor, 93 opposed, and 5 abstentions. So we now get to the main motion, which requires a two-thirds vote, and it is the motion on the pink, rose-colored supplement with, on page 6, the selectmen's motion affects use 29B in an L district, the fourth one from the right, and change SP to no. On the main motion, this is Article 17, main motion. Okay, the voting period is with us. The motion is approved by a vote of 200 in favor, 5 opposed, and 5 abstentions. Article 18. The motion is on 18-14 through 23. The general bylaw amendment, which requires only a majority vote. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. The vote is 210. I'm sorry, it's unanimous. No one voted against it, did they? Mr. Friedman? Okay, Article 19. The motion before us is that of Ms. Frawley, which would limit storefront retailers, delivery-only marijuana retailers, and social consumption marijuana retail licenses to 3 each. This requires a two-thirds vote, and this is Article 19, main motion. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a general bylaw amendment. It requires only a majority vote. Okay. One, if you...
Mr. Moderator, do I get a chance to make a presentation?
No.
No?
You certainly don't. I told you, well, we'll discuss it later, but you don't get a chance. You're voting on the motion on the blue supplement that was passed out tonight, which would limit the number of licenses in 3 different categories to 3. It's the Frawley, so-called Frawley motion. And that motion fails with 59 in favor, 146 against, and 3 abstentions. Ms. Carroll, did your request for electronic votes extend to Articles 20 and 21 and 22? No. Okay. Article 21, the motion at the bottom of page 20-4. Those in favor, please say aye. Sorry? I'm sorry, this is Article 20, motion at the bottom of page 20-4. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries by a majority vote. Article 21, the motion is on page 21-2. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 22, the excise tax article on page 22-3. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. No, we have
Just point of order,
voted.
Mr. Moderator. Did you take a vote on Article 19? I think you just took a vote on the amendment, but not on Article 19.
Article 19, there was only one motion before you, and that was the Frawley motion, and that motion failed. We voted at the beginning of town meeting to postpone consideration of Article 23, dealing with the devotion school, to the first thing next Tuesday night. There will be a session next Tuesday night, so we will proceed now to Article 24. And thank you for the members of the planning staff who've done a superb job. The motion under Article 24 is that of the well, I think the easiest way to do this is it's okay. It is the motion on page 1 and 2 of the orange supplement. It's the selectman's motion, and it's moved by Mr. Wyszynski and seconded by Mr. Doggett for the advisory committee. The advisory committee and the selectmen are in agreement on the selectman main motion being the motion before you. Mr. Lescoyer was the original petitioner. Come to the microphone in front, sir.
Mr. Moderator, my name is David Lescoyer, Precinct 11. I'm here to speak about the Brookline Land Bank proposal. This is a motion that asks the Select Board to appoint a Brookline Land Bank Study Committee. Here are some of the questions this committee may consider. Would a Brookline Land Bank serve to preserve the town's diversity? Or will luxury housing crowd out our affordable neighborhoods? What about our green spaces, parks, and excellent schools? Would a land bank help Brookline keep up with the growing demand on Brookline's public domain? Or will development pressure overwhelm the town? These are crucial questions that evoke a visceral reaction in Brookline. However, when it comes to Brookline's government, the problem is that the scope of the town's home rule power is inadequate. State laws and regulations impose many restrictions on cities and towns when it comes to taxing, spending, borrowing, purchasing, education, public works, public health, public safety, actually everything. The reason for a Brookline Land Bank is to enable the town to be proactive when confronting its growing need for school playgrounds, parks, open spaces, athletic fields that we heard so much about the other night, affordable housing, and a larger commercial tax base. The land bank's transfer tax revenue earmarked for these municipal purposes will enable the town to better control, manage, and overcome pressures from population growth and development. The first step is to vote favorable action on this motion. Once the Land Bank Study Committee has written its report and completed its work, the next step is for a future town meeting to authorize the Select Board to submit a petition to Brookline State Representative for land bank legislation. The Land Bank Study Committee should examine the advantages of a municipal transfer tax, consider an appropriate tax rate, a sound exemption schedule, and revenue estimates. Study the impact on real estate transactions, make recommendations regarding financial policies and management of land bank funds. Consider priority setting allocation policies for this potentially substantial, important strategic fund. Recommend governance structure, staffing, and effective integration of land bank roles, functions, and administration with town departments, and draft a home rule petition warrant article. The committee should have a broad range of skills and backgrounds, including town staff with knowledge of taxation, finance, budgeting, and law. In addition, the Select Board may recruit experts in land policy, economics, land banking, and community development. Other possible recruits might be veterans of prior similar committees, former elected officials, and persons with knowledge and experience with general court home rule petitions. Thank you very much, and please vote favorable action on this resolution.
Mr. Doggett? And ladies and gentlemen, remember as you leave to put your handheld devices in the bins provided in the, I think, rear of the auditorium or the lobby. Mr. Doggett?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, everybody. John Doggett, Precinct 13, and speaking for the Advisory Committee. Warrant Article 24, as originally proposed by the petitioner, was to authorize the Select Board to file a home rule petition for legislation that would establish a Brookline Land Bank. The Land Bank would be funded by imposing a real estate transfer tax on each of the property transactions in the town, and they would have been used to acquire land or buildings for the town's use. The Land Bank would have been administered by a commission which was proposed to be the Select Board. The Advisory Committee commends the petitioner on bringing to town meeting this interesting and big idea to enable the implementation of a long-term land use vision. The specific land uses that the legislation proposed were for affordable housing, open space, educational use, and economic development. It became clear during the Advisory Committee's public hearing and committee process that this legislation was extraordinarily complex, and there were basic questions of the impact of a real estate transfer tax deserve significant further analysis. I'd like to give you a couple more details about the idea and the discussion that went on. First, on the retail transfer tax. This was proposed to be a 1% tax which the town would levy on the value of each real estate transaction in the town, with a personal exemption of the first $500,000. So, for example, a $900,000 property sale in the town with that personal exemption would raise $4,000 in tax revenue. Some transactions were envisioned to be exempt altogether, such as first-time home buyers, charitable trusts, inter-Brookline transfers, etc. The town assessor estimated for the last year that with the exemptions proposed, the town would have raised $7 million, about what was raised in the current operating override. As you can see, this would represent a significant revenue stream. But bear in mind, it's not predictable unlike the existing property tax, because property prices go up and down. On the fund, the revenue would be accumulated year by year, and the Commission, with its property acquisition policy goals agreed, would be in a position to act in a nimble fashion to acquire property to meet those goals as property came to the market. During the Advisory Committee consideration process, there was significant agreement that this was a good and useful idea to explore, but concerns and questions were many. How would the purchase and sale mechanism actually work? Would town meeting be involved? If so, when in the process? Would town meeting involvement reduce the agility of the Commission in a dynamic real estate market? Would potential borrowing by the Commission impact the town's credit rating? Why not just collect the transfer tax and add it to the CIP? What are the exemptions? Are they too complex to administer? And the 4 designated areas of use, affordable housing, open space, educational and economic development uses, seem to be in fundamental conflict. How's that conflict to be resolved? Here in town meeting, perhaps? Should the town even be in the property development business? As you can see, there are many questions that were raised during this process. And as a result of these questions and discussions, with the petitioner and the advisory committee supported a jointly agreed resolution that is before this body tonight with one slight amendment the selectmen on one of the whereas clauses, the select
Well,
board.
that actually is not the case anymore. The main motion is the selectmen's motion.
Thank you.
And the advisory committee, which you represent, has agreed with it.
We have. I'm just getting that, Mr. Moderator. Thank you. On Article 24, the advisory committee votes to recommend the select board's motion because it made only one minor change to the whereas clause in that motion, and the change was very much in the spirit of the advisory committee's recommended motion, revised motion. So on a vote of 16 to 0 to 2, the advisory committee recommends the favorable action on the select board's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wyszynski.
Select Board recommends favorable action unanimously.
Mr. Gordon and Ms. Stone, please come forward. Ms. Stone and Ms. Pelkey, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Rebecca Stone, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. I signed up very early to speak in favor of this article because Mr. Lescoyer's original proposal seemed to me very focused on important issues that have been discussed already by him and by the Select Board and the Advisory Committee. The one area of concern I had with the original proposal that hasn't been mentioned and I think is important in directing the charge of the committee that will eventually be set up is whether or not a transfer tax should be levied on the buyer or the seller of the property. The original proposal suggested that early on that the buyers should pay this as a kind of an entry fee because of the many advantages of life in Brookline. I think that our extraordinarily high housing prices are already a serious barrier to entry to Brookline, and that to the point that even people who would be considered upper income in other parts of the country are having trouble finding a place to live here. If we're talking about affordable housing and about putting extra money into the affordability of housing in Brookline, I think it's important that we not tell buyers who already pay a premium for the entry to live here that they have to pay even more. I think affordability is about what we are asking people to pay. So a transfer tax levied at closing as part of a sale not only is so levied on the seller is a very common thing. I experienced this recently with the sale of my late father's apartment in New York City, and from the condo board, it's not something a seller necessarily looks forward to, but it is also consistent with people who have already reaped the benefits of the increased value of housing in Brookline, and have experienced, and it's sort of a parting gift to the town of Brookline to allow people to come in at affordable rates. So I urge for favorable action on the motion to refer the land bank to a committee, but I hope the select board will be explicit in its charge to that committee that the issue of who bears the burden of the tax is an essential one to resolve in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey. And Mr. Lepson, would you come forward, please?
Linda Olson, Pelkey, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. I support the idea of using a small real estate transfer tax to fund a Brookline land bank and commend David Lescoyer for bringing it forward. Land is a precious thing, especially here in Brookline, where we have almost 60,000 people living in 6 and a tinch square miles. A land bank is an idea whose time has come, and I hope that referral will bring a robust proposal back to town meeting soon. Let's remember the original purpose and goals of the land bank suggestion. It has long been understood that one of the main impediments to acquiring land for public purposes in Brookline is the fact that we have no dedicated funding source. In addition, this lack of a set-aside means that the town cannot respond quickly when and if a property becomes available that's desirable. But let's not confuse the goal of land acquisition with the goal of simply adding to our town coffers. One of the first tasks of a land bank study committee should be defining those land-based town goals and objectives that could be met most effectively through the land bank mechanism. Many other worthy town objectives may be best met through other means, such as zoning changes, the CIP, or public-private partnerships. The study committee could sort that out. Once the goals and objectives for acquiring land for public purposes are identified, it could be very helpful if the committee were to suggest priorities based on documented needs, such as those identified in the open space plan, the housing production plan, or the recently completed strategic asset and large parcel studies. A careful study of these and other planning efforts could be used to identify the key attributes of land parcels that would meet those needs. Rather than pitting various interest groups against one another, the study committee should recommend appropriate metrics that could help sort out priorities and relative financing needs for land acquisition for a variety of public purposes. On Tuesday, we spent a great deal of time debating the fate of a well-loved and well-used green space, Cypress Park. This debate illustrated the many compelling and competing open space needs in Brookline. Or stop by Winthrop Square Park in my neighborhood on a nice Saturday, and you'll witness one extremely crowded playground. As residential density increases, I, for one, believe the long-term future of our community depends on recognizing the need for additional park, recreation, and open space lands, which are accessible and strategically located to alleviate the most serious crowding, or which serve to protect environmentally sensitive areas. The study committee should also consider establishing procedures and mechanisms to assure that land acquired for public purposes remains public and maximizes the long-term potential to meet local public needs. For instance, retaining public ownership of the land via community land trust or other mechanism could remove the land costs from community trust controlled housing, which is then leased, retaining affordability in perpetuity. Or if a particular community development goal, such as providing artists live-work space or a community-based performance space were desired, how might public ownership of the land help facilitate its creation? As for the composition of the study committee, I hope that individuals with expertise in land conservation and land use planning would be included, along with the skills mentioned in the advisory committee's resolution. Please vote yes to refer Article 24 to a select board-appointed committee. Thank you.
Mr. Nero and Mr. Lowy, please come forward if you still wish to speak.
Good evening, Anthony Nero, Precinct 5, speaking on behalf of the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. We thank the petitioner for this, bringing this to town meeting, and we unanimously support this warrant article. Our biggest concern right now, as far as this goes, is not just green space for the town to enjoy, but fair housing. We have a shortage of affordable housing, and we hope that the study committee takes that into consideration, and in appointing members, does have somebody with the expertise in fair housing, because that is a big need in our town. Thank you.
Mr. Lowy.
Werner Lowy, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13, and member of the Conservation Commission. Brookline has exceptionally varied open spaces. We have historic parks and small public gathering spaces and commercial areas. We have ponds and wetlands. We have a vital urban forest. We have nature sanctuaries, and we have playing fields. We have pedestrian pathways and wildlife corridors. But because we're mostly already developed, it's very hard to acquire open space, And when remaining areas of private open space are lost, it often happens in such small increments and so quickly that it goes largely unnoticed. For decades, our open space plan has recommended that we create a mechanism for acquiring open space. And the Conservation Commission has recommended that we identify a source of revenue that can be used exclusively to create a fund for that purpose. Article 24 is broader than that, but it creates a forum in which to begin that discussion. And for that reason, I ask you to vote to refer this article so the discussion can begin. Thank you.
Thank you. On the, Mr. Fernandez?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Just want to either ask a question or just make a point. I know we have some time to discuss this after this warrant passes, which I think it will, and I plan on supporting it. I'm thinking about the funds from that will derive from this, the passage of this warrant article, and whether or not it will actually end up going toward affordable housing. In town meeting, we have an amazing constituency, as we saw on Tuesday night, in favor of the environment. Absolutely, and I'm one of those folks. I don't know how many folks we have that will speak as vociferously about affordable housing in this town, and I wonder if that environmental constituency, when we start to get to talking about where these funds will go, will just speak so much more loudly than those that that would be in favor of affordable housing and may not be represented in this group right here. So I wanted to voice that concern at least.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Friedman?
Harry Friedman, Precinct 12. Since I may be singled out for this, I thought I would explain in advance why I'm voting against this.
Oh, I won't do that to you anymore.
Thank you. This is a transfer tax that falls on a very small portion of the community. And it seems to me that if we're going to collect money for important community goals like affordable housing and open space and things such as that, it should fall on everybody, not simply people who are selling their homes. Second of all, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. The state has set up the Community Preservation Act, which has an existing framework to do exactly what this warrant article is seeking to do, and which also offers the opportunity of matching state money, which the land bank would not do. And third, as one of the members of the advisory committee who represents small business pointed out to us when we discussed this, because it's falling on the seller, it's much more likely that very often it will really fall on the real estate broker for all or part of this, and that's even less fair.
Thank you, Mr. Levy.
My name is Mark Levy, town meeting member, Precinct 7. First, on the issue of who the tax will fall on, I don't think it really matters who writes the check. In a seller's market, the buyer will end up eating it through an increase in the asking price of the building. In the unlikely event we have a buyer's market, the seller will end up eating it no matter who writes the check. So I think that's something that needs to be considered, but I don't think it's a key issue. For me, the key issue is how is this money going to be used? And I was around back many decades ago, way in the last millennium even, when my first encounter with the idea of a land bank came up during in the context of affordable housing. And now, 30 years later or so, 20 years later, 30 years later, something like that, you get old, you forget time. I think it's important that it not get lost. And I would advise the selectmen as they appoint the committee to A, make sure that it includes people who are in fact advocates for affordable housing, whether through the housing, the BHA, the Brookline Housing Authority, or individuals who have a track record in building and maintaining affordable housing. And two, that the committee recommend that there be some set of goals, how much money should go for open space, how much percentage of it should go towards educational purposes, economic development, and affordable housing. Not that all opportunities will be equal, And you may not always get to those goals in the short term, but I think it's important in the long term that the affordable housing not be lost in the mix. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Michael Alprin, Precinct 10. And given what was just mentioned about the state matching funds for the Community Preservation Act, I'm just wondering if this motion is restricting the committee just to study a land bank, or if this committee could also study the Community Preservation Act and becoming a local member under the act.
Mr. Wyszynski?
I don't take this motion as restricting, and I was just leaning over to Select Person Green asking, boy, it sounds like we ought to meld into this some thinking on the CPA. So I would be in favor of that, but we'll be developing the charge in the coming weeks, so we'll see how it goes.
Ms. Khan?
Yes, Janice Khan, Precinct 15. That was actually my concern as well, that I know this body has twice rejected the CPA, but it seems to me that given the interest in exactly the same areas that the CPA is designed to generate in revenue for, that we should give it another try, and I would hope that the committee does look at that. Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
Gary Jones, Precinct 3. And I have a second home in Falmouth, Mass. And Falmouth, Mass, several years ago, adopted the land bank. And I just want to tell you that we have an obligation, I think, to future generations. Falmouth and Brookline have something in common. They had generations in the past that set aside open space and provided for affordable housing. Not every community is in a position to do that or is willing to make the sacrifice. We make the sacrifices for our schools and good public services, but I think we have to think about the generations to come after us, not just our children and grandchildren, but I think that something like a land bank is going to be something that, like Falmouth has done over the past decade, they provided affordable housing and they provided more and more open space that would not have been there. It would have been left for developers, and there wouldn't have been affordable housing for people to afford to live in town. I think it's something that we owe to future generations.
Thank you. On the motion on pages 1 and 2 of the orange supplement, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries by a majority vote. Article 25. The motion under Article 25 is on pages 25-6 to 7, moved by Ms. Granoff, seconded by Mr. Wyszynski, that to authorize the selectmen to file a petition with the state legislature relating to property tax relief for low and moderate income seniors in the town. Ms. Granoff.
Okay. So far, so good. Okay. Susan Granoff, Precinct 7. Okay. Brookline is at increasing risk of losing its middle-class homeowners and its economic diversity. Without new action by town meeting, I believe that this problem will only get worse in the future, what with our many recent and likely future tax overrides and debt exclusions. This is a problem of special concern to those Brookline senior homeowners who purchased their homes decades ago and are now retired, living on limited, modest incomes, and are having increasing difficulty paying their rapidly escalating property taxes. I proposed Article 25 to help in a modest way address this problem and also to correct a growing inequity. During the past decade, an increasing number of Brookline senior homeowners no longer qualify for the state senior circuit breaker income tax credit that the state specifically enacted in 1999 to help senior homeowners just like them, senior homeowners with low and modest incomes and high property taxes. They no longer qualify for this income tax credit, currently worth up to $1,080 a year, solely because their Brookline residences no longer meet the property value qualification amount of this tax credit, which is based on a statewide average of the assessed values of all single-family residences throughout the state, and which does not accurately reflect Brookline's property values. Compounding this problem, since the real estate collapse of 2008, property values in other parts of the state have plummeted, while property values of Brookline residences have continued to increase at 5 to 10% a year. In 2008, the circuit breaker's property qualification amount was $793,000. In the succeeding years, it continued to fall each year until by 2015, it was $100,000 lower than in 2008, $693,000. Currently, the qualification amount is $747,000, which is still nearly $50,000 below what it was a decade ago. Not surprisingly, during this same time period, the number of Brookline seniors claiming this income tax credit fell. At its peak in 2009, there were 360 Brookline claimants. By 2015, even though the senior population of Brookline had grown by 28% during the same time period, the number of Brookline senior claimants had actually fallen to 328. In comparison, the total number of senior claimants throughout the state of this credit in 2015 was 86,000, an increase of 22% since 2008. Article 25 addresses this problem by creating a Brookline program that would have the exact same income and other requirements as the state circuit breaker credit, but would apply the formula the circuit breaker credit uses for determining the property valuation qualification amount strictly to Brookline residences. According to our chief assessor, Gary McCabe, for tax year 2018, this qualification amount would be about $1.2 million. The proposed program would be relatively simple to administer. It would be open only to those seniors who do not otherwise qualify for the state circuit breaker credit. The applicant would only need to provide a copy of their federal tax return and a completed state circuit breaker tax form and worksheet, which would specify exactly how much of a credit they qualified for. This amount would be deducted from their property taxes. I estimate that is likely to help a maximum of 50 senior households, a number which Gary McCabe thinks is reasonable if somewhat generous, or about the same number of seniors who participate in all the other Brookline senior property tax relief programs combined. And this would be at a relatively low and fairly predictable cost to the town of $55,000 a year or less. The money for this would be drawn from the overlay reserve account. If this inequity to Brookline seniors is going to be corrected, the solution will have to come from the town, not the state. At the state level, Senator Cream has introduced many proposed amendments to the state circuit breaker credit legislation to make it fairer to Brookline seniors, but her efforts have failed because the representatives and senators whose constituents benefit from the way it currently operates have no interest in changing it. I suspect that the Brookline senior homeowners most in need and most likely to benefit from this warrant article are senior women living alone, particularly those in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. While Brookline's median household income in 2016 was nearly $97,000, and the median household income of couples with dependent children was nearly $200,000, the median household income of Brookline senior women living alone was $32,500. Why this huge disparity in income? First, women tend to live longer than men, and their retirement savings need to be stretched over a much longer period of time. Second, due to social and economic norms, older women have generally earned much less in their lifetime than men. Many senior women grew up at a time when it was commonplace for women to stay at home when their children were young, and single-income households were the norm. And even when they entered the workforce, women's salaries were extremely low, 401ks didn't exist then, and they often didn't work long enough for their pensions to vest. So bear in mind that providing adequate help to Brookline's low and modest income seniors is not only a senior issue, it's a gender issue as well. One of the many qualities that makes Brookline so special is that we as a community value diversity in all its many forms, including age and economic diversity. And we pride ourselves on being an age-friendly municipality. But even in a generally affluent town like Brookline, there are hundreds of seniors who are having increasing difficulty paying their real estate taxes. Many purchased their homes and condos decades ago. Through all the years of their living in Brookline, these seniors have paid their taxes and provided stability, historic memory, and volunteer services to our town, and in every possible way have made a huge investment in Brookline. They don't want to be forced to have to leave their homes at this time. So now, when our town requires multiple overrides and debt exclusions to fund the educational costs of an unexpected increase in our school-age population, our town also needs to do more to help these senior owners. Thus, I urge you to vote favorable action for warrant Article 25. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waschinsky.
Neil Waschinsky for the Select Board. Select Board thanks Ms. Granoff for bringing this forward. She has identified a way of helping seniors who are low income but have high house values or low house values, or depending. But it's an elegant solution if the legislature will allow us to do it. So we think it's worth trying. It's worth filing with the legislature. It's easy to administer. The cost seems to be modest, and it will help some folks who need help. So we hope you'll vote favorable action.
Mr. Birnbaum?
Thank you. Mr. Moderator, Ben Birnbaum, at-large member of the Advisory Committee, and standing at this podium for the first time in 10 years. Yes, thank you. I don't know if you should applaud a guy who returns to town meeting after having escaped for 10 years, but here I am. It's great to see old friends here, and I mean old. And actually, the most delightful moment this evening was finally learning what fearful specter can keep Sandy from slamming that hammer down when you overstay your welcome at this podium, and the answer is rabbinic authority. That gentleman said, and finally, 3 times. I haven't seen anybody survive that, and I spent 10 years in this room. I don't have a whole lot to say, and I look at the clock and I recognize it's late for all of us. This is a virtuous, worthy effort. Those of you who kept track of the Select Board's study group on on seniors know that this came up then. It was not one of the 3 warrant articles that you voted in the fall, including one that was a home rule petition. But Ms. Granoff is nothing but, shall we say, persistent. She persisted, as I believe someone once said, in the halls of Congress. And it's a good idea. It's not going to cost much. At least at the present moment, it's going to cost very little. $55,000 a year is what Susan believes it will be and what the town believes it will be. And that is a rounding error, as they say in a Brookline budget. And it may help 50 folks. Not a whole lot, $1,000 a piece. But those of us who have watched our parents or others in our families age know the kind of anxiety that builds up, and $1,000 can make a difference as much as Xanax in lowering that level of anxiety. And so I think we should, on behalf of the advisory committee, I will say we should vote this up, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Vitolo and Ms. Stone, will you come forward? You don't have to come forward together. But it would be nice if you would. You're on, Mr. Vitolo.
Tommy Vitolo, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. This warrant article is about sending a clear message to our state legislature. 1, we value our seniors. 2, we recognize that the finances of seniors vary widely. And 3, the residential real estate prices in the various regions of Massachusetts are indeed quite varied. We need policies that recognize and respect all 3 of these items. This would be our second home rule petition in as many years, and that's okay. My hope is that the legislature will not pass a home rule petition on this matter, but rather will make tax policy fair across the Commonwealth. After all, we're not the only community that loves our more experienced friends and neighbors. We're not voting on specific legislation. We're voting to emphasize that our senior tax policies need reform. And that includes adequately funding senior affordable housing initiatives. That includes revising the property tax deferral rules to be more inclusive. And that includes reforming the senior circuit tax break credit regulations. Please send the message that we want to help our seniors age in place. Please vote favorable action.
Thank you, Ms. Stone. And Ms. Vanderzeel, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am Rebecca Stone, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. This warrant article seeks to fix, at our local level, something that the state legislature should have fixed for the entire Commonwealth and may yet. It's one of many things that needs to improve up on Beacon Hill. The local senior tax credit is a very important element in how we make our town age-friendly and enable those unlimited fixed incomes to age in place here. Because of the increases in our housing values, seniors in Brookline who should be able to take advantage of the circuit breaker have not qualified, and so we see claims falling when they should be going up. This is something we can and should do as we address the growth of our senior population along with the growth in our school-age population, and we strive to keep Brookline affordable for all. I urge favorable action.
Thank you, Ms. Vanderzeel and Mr. Carroll. Well, I'm sure the last 2 speakers will be brief.
Hi, I'm Cornelia Vanderzeel. I'm Town Meeting Member from Precinct 15, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. We held a public hearing on this on May 9th and voted unanimously favorable action. I urge you to vote favorable action.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll, can you beat that?
Yeah, I'm Frank Carroll, Precinct 10.
It shouldn't surprise you that Brookline Can is supportive of this measure. I want to just take this opportunity to congratulate Susan Granoff for this proposal. This is an item that she brought to us on her own initiative. She was highly persistent in pursuing it. It's well thought out, well crafted, workable. So this is, we should congratulate her. Thank you.
Thank you. On the motion at the bottom of page 25-6, over to the top of 25-7, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. I will now... Whoops. 169 to 1. I'll now entertain a motion to adjourn town meeting until 7 o'clock next Tuesday. Is there a second? Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Town meeting is adjourned until 7 o'clock next Tuesday, May 29. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.